Live. All right, we're live. Welcome everybody to the Bevry community. We're here to discuss John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, lecture 36 and 37, hopefully. We're joined here today by myself, John Buck, and Pleasure of Doubt, or Brett, and Nicholas, and also Tyler, who's off camera right now, and also Craig Reed. Hey, Craig.
Hello, hello. How are you?
Doing good. Glad to have you on the channel again.
Glad to be here.
I know. Let's see. You were on SJ's channel earlier today, weren't you?
Yes, we were. I was on with what's his Converse Contender?
Yeah, Converse Contender. I like his channel.
Yeah, his channel's really good. He's great in these discussions. We've been taking one a week. Last week we did the Inspiring Philosophy versus Matt Dillahunty debate and just analyzed it, broke it down. And this morning there's a debate with Matt Dillahunty and Glenn Scrivener, I think his name is, which is really, really good. Basically on the same topic. It's the sort of like the sociological utility of religion. Is Christianity beneficial to society? And this guy I thought was really first rate. And then we play like 5 minutes of it and then we break it down and analyze it. It's fun. It's really good. It's good, cool. Good conversation.
Yeah, and I think, because like Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy, he's going to be debating Matt Dillahunty, tomorrow morning, I think, is their second debate now.
Oh, is it tomorrow morning? I thought it was tomorrow night.
I think it's tomorrow morning, but I'm not exactly sure. I just know it's tomorrow, the 18th. But also, I should mention, I'll be interviewing the author Yuri Vovchenko tomorrow on this channel. Actually, he wrote a book called Answers in Simulation. He also has a YouTube channel kind of going over some of the simulationist arguments. I only found out about him after I did my debate on Think Club regarding the simulation theory / hypothesis. And we kind of had a little bit of a back and forth and wanted to get a better understanding of simulationism and kind of talk with them. So that should be fun. We're doing that tomorrow morning too.
And if we're plugging, I think if all goes according to schedule, I think next Thursday, I'm going to be talking with Andrew Stratelites about his version of the ontological argument for God. So that'll be an interesting discussion. Hopefully, we've been trying to get it going for a while, so I'm glad we're finally getting it on. Which reminds me, I have to go back and read up on it and prepare for that.
Cool. Yeah, that should be fun. All right, so let's see. What Brett, do you want to kind of like go over maybe kind of the broader, I guess, topic or subject points to the lecture itself, and then we can kind of go into it on that level, and then if we need to kind of get further into the details.
Yeah, so 36 he starts off by wrapping up the topics we've been talking about over the last couple weeks in terms of symbols and the sacred and sacredness. He goes into mythology, which he really talks about the mythos, and I don't think we got to this. We were supposed to get to this last week, but I don't think we got there. So I'll probably should summarize it. So what he's saying is that these symbols, when they're related to religio, have a mythos usually attached to it. So there's a particular mythos attached with the symbol that seem to be indispensable for people, that help them, he says, activate, appreciate, and accelerate their religio. So that because of the way in which the relevance, I always put RR, but then I forget what it is. Relevance realization machinery is evolving. That it's always part of your ongoing religio. So he even says, like, to say it's my religio is wrong. Religio is a process, this process of relevance realization. And so even though a particular mythos may be indispensable for a person, he wants to make the difference between, he sees mythos as a way of enacting your religio, and it's not necessarily the truth or the content of the mythos that is important. So it's to say we have these different religions. So Christianity would be a mythos and it has all its sub-mythos. Buddhism would be a mythos. And he wants to say that just because a mythos is indispensable for a person in terms of their meaning their meaning machinery, that it's indispensable to an individual group, that doesn't mean it's metaphysically necessary. And what I take from this is that he sees the mythos as a tool, and that it doesn't really matter what the particular mythos is, as long as it helps you to achieve, to enact these symbols, to have this participatory perspectival knowing, to get your religio and relevance realization going. And so it's not about the truth. It's not about the truth of the myth. It's about what the myth does. And so to me, I like this idea. I mean, this resonates with me. I think certain theists, I can imagine taking some objection to that, where the truth of their mythos is important.
Well, and I had a number of bits specifically revolving around this, and it's interesting because I both heavily agree and disagree with him here, and I think a lot of it comes down to perhaps a difference in how we're defining metaphysics. So in that sense, I agree that a propositional form of metaphysics should be de-emphasized, that's not what metaphysics, that's not what it's for. It's not there to sit here and argue back and forth about the propositions and the exact formulation of them. Instead, the metaphysics should be the context, and it should be an embodied sense of the world. And through that embodied sense, it kind of, moves up the layers that till when we are trying to communicate it, it comes out as propositions about the world. But to confuse the state one is experiencing reality with as being propositional in nature, I agree with him. That's a mistake.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can get out of this. I don't think you can get out of metaphysics in that regard. And there's a number of points where Vervaeke is overtly referencing metaphysics and just uses a different word to make it sound like he isn't talking about metaphysics, which after a certain point, and when you catch on to it, it starts to feel dishonest. So there's like a weird bit there, like he's trying to, I understand re-emphasizing it. Perhaps I just disagree with the way he's doing it.
Right. Yeah. At least the kind of point that stood out to me, just because I noticed how often Vervaeke is intentionally trying to avoid building any sort of metaphysical worldview. But in this point, he laid it out pretty clearly in regards to like the combinatorial explosiveness of reality. So a thing is a bottle cap, has no thingness to it. Like none of, like, what was his exact term? Let me see. Like there is no thingness to reality. Like reality is combinatorially explosive. And it reminded me sort of the postmodern problem of like anything can have an infinite amount of interpretations of the thing. And so that's
right. But he didn't seem to be saying he's an idealist there.
No,
using idealist language.
I didn't even interpret it like that. Just rather that, okay, like dismissive of essentialism. So there's an essence to the pin about like what a pin does, what a description of a pin is, its function, everything about a pin within the pin itself. And he was kind of like dismissing that. No, there's no essence to a pin because there are infinite ways in which you can use a pin or think of a pin or dissect
like the way
Right.
I want to come back
There's
to
no
Neil's point in a
essence.
second, but the way I see that though is not that there's no thingness there, but when you think about what a thing is, like anything, most things are mixtures of other things, so a pen is a mixture of atoms that are formed into molecules and so on and so forth. And we can look at any of these things at different layers of abstraction. So we can look at a pen as a pointy thing. We can look at a pen as a writing utensil. We can look at the pen as something to hold, something to put in my teeth, chew on while I'm thinking. We could look at it on a on a molecular level or on the big level. So yes, but it doesn't mean that there's no thing there. it means that that things can be seen in a multitude of ways.
Right. Yeah,
But-
yeah. And that's how I was
Well-
understanding him. Like it's not that like the thing doesn't actually exist, but the like the word or the idea that we have to describe a thing is not what it is. Like there's more to it than that. I guess similar to how he says that like meaning make or no relevancy isn't an ontological reality, but a dynamic transjective reality. It seemed like that was, maybe that's not an apt comparison, but at least this is where he's kind of laying out his almost postmodern worldview of there, like disregarding all of Aristotle and any sort of essentialism for objects in reality.
I think it's important to note also that he is very clearly trying to synthesize his Buddhist, his appreciation and practice of Buddhism with cognitive science. And I mean, that's literally where this idea of nothingness and the terms he's using are coming from.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So when we're talking about, specifically when he's talking about nothingness, it helps to understand the Buddhist frame and how they've dealt with this concept of nothingness and how prevalent it is throughout the philosophy. But it's I recommend reading the Heart Sutra. It focuses on emptiness and nothingness very specifically, and it's the most read text in Mahayana Buddhism. So it's it's there, and it's ironic. There's deep deconstruction taking place, and it's set up in what one might almost consider a very ironic context, right? Because the sage, I forget which one, is basically answering a question of, if a young rich prince comes to us and asks about the attainment of wisdom, what do we tell him? And then he goes into this long thing about how emptiness is form and form is emptiness. And then he goes through all of the senses, all these major categories that were originally set up through the Buddhist philosophy. So he's commenting on things within the, culture. But he's basically saying everything is emptiness, right? Everything is nothingness. And that's useful for seeing how they play with these terms, right? Again, you get into non-logical identities, right? Form is emptiness and emptiness is form. It's trying to show you something that is not meant to be made sense of with the mind.
Well, it's even like a practical psychological tool that you can use. Like there's either a Buddhist or a Taoist story of the farmer whose son breaks his arm, and then his son finds a wild horse. The horse like runs off with the other horses. The son goes to chase down the horse, comes back, breaks his arm, and then can't go into the war. And there's like this series of like, oh, it looks like things are going well for the farmer. Like,
well, and then bad, and
yeah,
well,
like,
and bad, and each
well,
one.
maybe.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, if you have this mindset of, I guess, emptiness, then it provides for you almost like a narrative that is not too concretized or not too anchored to anything specific in reality. Yeah.
It seemed like like and back to Nick, what you were saying before, like how I see this sort of, okay, any mythos will do, to put it sort of succinctly, is against dogmatism, that all of these, that we shouldn't be hating people who follow a different mythos, because their mythos are probably doing a similar type of thing than our preferred mythos, and that there doesn't have to be a right, the mythos that is the correct mythos, that these stories are all doing things for us, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, or Harry Potter for that matter.
And in many cases, and likely on many of the most important aspects of these religions, there's a clear juncture point on like all of them. So yes, some of the background metaphysics hits in conflicting ways, and particularly if we give uncharitable readings.
Juncture point meaning?
Like where they diverge from each other,
or connect with each other, I think is what he means, right?
Which are you meaning, Nick?
Oh, was I confusing there? I meant in many important points, there's a place where they combine into a single philosophy.
Gotcha.
But then when we start digging into the actual right, again, this propositional orientation, they start to kind of like rip themselves apart. And so we might say that there's something really important unified throughout these very successful mythos, mythi. I don't know what the plural is.
Mythoses.
Mythoses. In the existential aspect. And that if we kind of elevate that point, then it's a lot easier to get along well with others.
Yeah, and he would say, I think, combinations in the psychotechnology aspect of these mythoses.
Well, and what the actual experience feels like, how we encode the experience, right, in the propositional form such that we may communicate it. That's where you start producing errors and category errors and all this stuff. But it's also necessary to communicate. So the other thing, though, and a warning. Sorry, go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
No, I was just going to say, because what John said is very true. Like he kind of rejects all forms of essentialism. We were even talking about that last week, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But for the purposes of having a conversation about something, it's really useful. What Pleasure Doubt started with is the religious person, or the always has like a dogma that they are actually believe is true, and that's part of the point. So they're never going to be like, okay, we're just sort of free floating with all these ideas the way he's saying it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about specifically, Craig. It is like Vervaeke mentions that it may very well be the case, and he seems to indicate that he thinks it's plausibly the case that there are certain mythoses that are indispensable to people in their daily lives and also within history. That it's not to say that this is like metaphysically true, but the mythos itself is serving this function for people and such that they wouldn't be able to exist in the adequate way. That's what I mean. Like exist in a living sort of.
The analogy he gives is that English is indispensable for us, but we wouldn't say it's the only language out there. But in our society, you need to speak English, or you can't get around.
Right. Okay. Yes. That's everything is true. That's just been said. That English is a language and it's indispensable to us, but that doesn't mean it's the only language out there. Now, one of the ways that I've talked about religion is that religious iconography is the language of the subconscious mind. So and this is vaguely related to what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, it's definitely related. That's like what he talks about with religio. It is kind of
So you have a spiritual experience, and if you had, like my sister had a spiritual experience prior to becoming a Christian, if you are a Hindu having that experience, you go, wow, Shiva was really, really speaking to me. It's the identical experience. You might be connecting to something genuine and transcendent, right? But if you're raised in a religious tradition, you are going to use the tools of that tradition to express it, because that's the only language you have available to you.
Like, and it might be on that point, I would actually push back against characterizing him as non-essentialist. I think he is essentialist. I think he hides his essentialism.
What essentialism is again? Just a
so like
essentialism.
Within Aristotle, like the essence to a dog is that it has 4 legs, a tail, and it barks or something like that. That's like if you were to take it's not like abstracting out. Well, I guess from Aristotle, it would be kind of like abstracting out from the particulars, but the commonality.
Basically, that there's an essence to something that makes it that thing.
Right.
Something deeper. Yes, something deeper that contributes to.
And in that case,
the thing that makes it intelligible, really.
English is indispensable but not essential. I would agree. However, what about communication?
Yeah, I was thinking that, like, even
Nick, high five. That's it right there.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, it may be the case that, sure, the word apple doesn't have to relate directly to the fruit that we have for apple, but it might be the case that for any language that you have in which apples are a necessary food source, you have to have a word for that necessary food source, or like whatever other practical utility there are to existing. Like, you have to have a word for sex, you have to have a word for food, you have to have a word for family, things like that. These are all social constructions. I guess
you're starting to stray maybe into ambiguous territories. We like, in general terms, if we want to describe a universe where objects move and things have like borders and boundaries, there are certain conditions that you have to have, right? And it seems like communication's one of them, of some kind. At the bare minimum, like, we're producing like incredible conversation levels here, but like, the light is a type of communication, a very basic kind that is so essential we don't even experience it as a type of communication. Is just only the thing that is, right? So
also, when he gets into his practices for addressing the problems of the meaning crisis, it relies very heavily on various, what I can only describe as things he's perceiving as essential qualities of being itself.
Yeah.
So
or
right, even communitas.
Right.
In order to have communitas, you must have communication. So again, you end up at this like, you're playing, he's like hiding with one hand and then showing you with the other, right? Look, English is indispensable but not essential.
Right, but it makes sense.
Yeah, but it's not about English, right?
But he's always tying it directly to this fundamental need that he has to divorce it from metaphysics, right?
Yeah.
Like it's
or I don't know that he wants to divorce it from metaphysics, but the metaphysics that he brings is naturalism.
Hold on a second.
Yeah, I think
that's
wait, hold on, wait. I don't know if you can hear this.
That which generates sacredness.
Hold on.
Indispensability with metaphysical necessity. If we could give up identifying the sacred, that which generates sacredness, as the supernatural.
Okay, see, right.
Right. So it's not that he's giving up metaphysics, but that the metaphysics is.
Well,
the
I could rewind it further.
He's like disentangling the the metaphysics from what is meaning making. So it's no longer
realization.
Yeah. So it's no longer that all of our will to live or reasons for living are built up onto this thing that is kind of like outside of our scientific capabilities.
And again, I wouldn't use scientific ability to understand there, but I do see the point of removing the importance of the propositional metaphysics. But again, I don't think that means that you've done anything with metaphysics other than
but hold on.
Remember what it was originally used for.
You certainly haven't dispensed with the Discord servers that have popped up to discuss all the metaphysics that he brings up, right? So.
But just to be clear, where he's separating the sort of, say, the ontological reality of the myth, is he separating what the myth does from the truth of the myth in terms of the contents. He is definitely in all of this presenting a metaphysical view of naturalism. So he's just saying that you may have a non-naturalist mythos, that all these different mythoses provide similar roles, do similar things, regardless of what metaphysics the mythos represents. So, but let's just be careful not to say that I don't think he's dispensing with metaphysics. He thinks naturalism wins. I mean, he makes that, I think, pretty clear, that his new religion that's not a religion is based on naturalism. He says that, I don't know if it's in 36 or 37, but basically, it's naturalist.
Again, I would even disagree with, I mean, maybe, yeah. It just seems like he smuggles a whole hell of a lot under the title of naturalism, if that's the case.
Well, he's smuggling in Buddhism.
No, but I think he is smuggling in Buddhism.
That's pretty.
But here's the thing.
He was pretty explicit for this.
The title
37.
Yeah, Buddhism and cognitive.
And all of his cognitive resources for dealing with the perennial problems are directly related to Buddhist practices.
Yeah.
But I think this is also where the bridge is, that no matter what your metaphysical point of view, we can all participate in these experiences. We may have a different grammar for them. We may, think about them propositionally differently, but we're all participating in similar processes, regardless of whether Christian, atheist, Buddhist, Hindu. We're not as different as, I know this is my thing, we're not as different as we seem just based on our our mythos.
So
you have to pause it there, right? And like this is where the crux of the matter, to not put too fine a pun on it, is important. All right. The deep question is, to what degree do these metaphysical systems influence the level at which he's willing to discuss this, right? To what degree did Christianity help produce the flowering fruit of Western life? To what degree is his cognitive science apparatus the direct product of the sculpted mind of the metaphysical Christian process? So, like, the statement is, there's a couple of statements that I'm not necessarily okay with, right? So to the question of the essence of things, I think this also overlaps with and ties with the question of combinatorial explosion, and you can kind of see it in mathematics. Even though you have an infinite number of integers, you can classify them according to simple rules and then completely dispense with them in very arbitrary ways. Like, so you can say even and odd, right? And suddenly, even though you have an infinite number of things, you can partition it into two halves, so to speak, right? That kind of order is now existent. And you can say that there is an evenness and an oddness to things, right? So this kind of aspect is always present.
Even from artificial systems like mathematics, if you want to call it artificial, because it is basically indispensable.
Abstract more than artificial.
Well, physical structure can be represented as a topological structure. So
so even with these types of indispensable psychotechnologies, there is essentialness to the structures, or to within the structures themselves.
Right. And I think it also has
like the word apple, when I'm speaking within an English context, has an essence to it that I'm actually referring to the red or green fruit.
Yes, and most of it is implicit though, right? So most of it's baked into the manner in which you and I interpret, the way that we compile and then and pack and unpack the meaning of that. So the essence is rather than deal with so when you say apple, rather than deal with the combinatorial explosion of possibilities for its meaning, I have some really simple essences that help me kind of constrain the categorical space with which that word may exist. And that's in fact why context is so important, right? Like that. This is why, in fact, we can read through sentences where all of the letters in the words are jumbled up, right? But except for the first and last letters. Have you gone through that experiment? That's fun. The way the brain works is fascinating, and how it chunks information, let's say. But yeah, I think there are essential qualities directly related to essences, to any kind of system, period. Like systems, right, require these things. So you can't escape it. And on top of that, there's something deep. Okay, so most of this stuff is highly analytical, right? And he points this out. It's highly analytical. And this is another sidebar issue that he brings up in Vanderklay's space, right? That the issue of scalability, whether or not this kind of depiction is going to comport with like a significant number of the population. It's highly analytic, in other words. And not everyone is designed or preferred or capable of doing that. So,
and everyone has their own combination.
Yes. Okay. So right. So there's that's left hemispherical, by the way. So right over here in the right hemisphere, all the empty shadow spaces that people rarely touch on, all the unknowns, which are gigantic, those are truly combinatorial explosive. They exist there forever, all the time, like jumbling up, and you've got to make sense of them all the time, right? And like, I have not seen personally in my life anything make more sense to certain kind of jumbled up lives than, say, like a sudden adoption of a Christian metaphysic and the notion of like the resurrection and forgiveness and the atonement and all of that stuff, right? Like,
Yeah,
that's purely empirically, right?
Yeah, that's really an interesting point that I don't know. I'd like to see more thought and actual like discussion put into it, because there is this kind of fact about the, I guess, IQ or like there are boundary conditions to wisdom where it's a highly technical analytical, like Spinoza's ethics. That's not something that isn't probably going to have very much of a I don't know, broad scale that it can I don't know, mimetically replicate itself
On scalability, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
All we got to do is chop off like the bottom 90% of the bell curve, John, and we're good.
But it really is an interesting thing, especially in regards to religion, that like I was re-listening to the discussion, I think, between Sam Harris, Eric Weinstein, and Ben Shapiro. And one of the questions for Sam Harris was something like, okay, we recognize that the Enlightenment has brought about something incredible with scientific thinking and all of that, but we have to also recognize that the Bible has sort of this starting point foundation for a lot of people in which like they can return to it similar to what Vervaeke talks about with reading Plato, that it's this source of eternal like wisdom making. And the question was asked of Sam Harris.
That's another
like,
thing we're supposed to accept on faith, by the way. I don't know if that's true, right? Like,
well, at least for Vervaeke it is. That's the thing. Like, I don't think for most of the population, Plato could have that sort of
I think it's
eternal...
a P or NP problem personally. And I don't think Vervaeke's life is long enough for us to even begin to unpack whether or not it's combinatorial exposure.
Anyway, the question that was asked of Sam Harris is like, okay, what do you replace the Bible with it that doesn't have all of the bullshit within it, or however Sam Harris might want to put it. And he said like, well, all of human literature, that's kind of like, you don't need to have this one specific thing. And I don't know, that at least like, that's another core component to what a religion is that it's not, you don't have to read all of human literature in order to have some sort of starting mythos or foundation to kind of like work off of.
Well, and when it's shared,
right, his answer is a non-answer.
Right, exactly, Craig.
His answer is a non-answer because it's too all-inclusive, so that it's basically anything. Just, my answer is, space. It's like completely
build your own path,
and you'll rip apart communitas in the process.
So this cuts into the. So when I mean of essentialist by how John, I don't know exactly how John meant it, but I meant it in context of Vervaeke of like, there's no true metaphysical reality that undergirds all these different variations of metaphysical speculation. Now, I would totally fundamentally disagree with that. But
I don't think that's what Vervaeke is meaning. I think he's saying there's no like logos or two objects.
Logos what?
Like logos to objects.
There's no
like,
relevance is not inherent.
Right. Yeah. That was the point that he was making, and why he's kind of dispensing with essentialism is because of the fact that relevancy, if located ontologically within
it's
some
not a
specific
property of
thing,
the object, it's a property of the person in relation to the object.
Right. Like his point is that relevancy is dynamic, where what is relevant at one point in time is not always going to be relevant in future times. So if you essentialize the sacredness within a certain specific object, or if you if you locate the relevancy within the object as an essence, then you're setting yourself up you're setting yourself up for failure, really.
Right, but okay,
or self-deception and destruction. Yeah, sorry, Craig.
No problem. The underlying point of a religion, almost every religion, if it's a real religion that somebody is near and dear to them, sacred, and they participate in as a truly committed believer, is that there is such a thing as a true north, not just a true north in relation to where you are now, but a true north, a like, this is the right way to live, full stop, period. And all like people who are fully committed to a religion really deeply believe that about their actual religion. Not that it's one possible mythos amongst many, but this is the true way to live. This is how, it's really important to them at a very, very deep, primal, I don't know if ontological is the right word, but a deep, primal, committed level. This is live and breathe to me. This is absolute importance.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, just thinking about it, if I were to try to like glean my wisdom from all the different like sources of literature and history, then I would be getting a lot of conflicting worldviews coming at each other and like messages that I'm taking in. And that's just like hard to really parse out between all these. Like, how am I supposed to like enmesh Spinozistic metaphysics with Platonic
don't you think
metaphysics?
to an extent, well, hasn't Vervaeke done that to an extent? Like, over these 50 lectures, especially the first third of them, where he's going over the history, and he's pointing out
to it.
The benefits of but we can take some of these mythologies and these symbols from Christianity, from Buddhism. Like, he's sort of trying to take the best of all of them and bring them together. This notion of sacrifice and agape from Christianity, and meditation,
right.
and
but what
technologies of
what
Buddhism.
He's doing is what I forget who said it, Nick. It's very similar to what Nick said with the language. Let's say it's all music. He's still making music. Yes, he's picking all these really cool bits from all of these different widely variant traditions, but he's still making music, and music making is deeply important to him. And in that sense, there's an essentialism there that's actually really, really connected and really important to where people live and breathe their faith. Nobody thinks their faith is just a random mythology that could be replaced with any other. Nobody actually participates in life that way.
Yeah.
Right. And but people don't do that even when they know that's what's true.
Well, but hold on. Don't you think, like me as a non-theist, there are still things I can take out of. No, but there are still. Sorry, I missed what was that?
No,
he was just taking a dig.
Jerking your chin.
No, but me as a non-theist, I can still look at, the Bible and take lessons from it and appreciate wisdom from it. I can look at the Buddha and take lessons from him and appreciate wisdom from him without. Like, I can say these are good things. This is wise. I don't like other parts of it, but this I like, and it resonates with me, and I can use that. So
yes,
how familiar are you all with the New Age?
I'm not overly familiar,
because this is a long project.
It's exactly what New Age
been going on for
totally...
like a while now, and I think it is a fair criticism to level at him. Granted, he basically tried to take the New Age project and ground it heavily in science. He's also not remotely the first to attempt that either. But if you look at the New Age and the communities and the practices and everything that it forms, there's very, very real problems with its structure that he has not addressed. So
like what? That's an interesting statement. What? Not in depth, but like briefly, what do you mean?
Ego, ironically, is huge.
That one's clear. If we're going more abstract and thinking from like a systems organization standpoint, if you blend a bunch of things together, and he's trying to blend a bunch of things together in a very delicate way, such that it makes something interesting. But generally, when you blend a bunch of crap together, you get mud.
Right.
And
okay, I got you. Okay.
You almost implant a type of modal confusion that is extremely hard to get out of, because it's operating at several meta levels above your daily operating procedure.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that was kind of what I was kind of getting from Craig's point, was that like, at least within religions, there is some sort of like canon literature of canon together. So like you don't have to worry about like, oh no, St. Paul, he's saying something that's coming in conflict with Jesus at this point, and or with St. Maximus or something like that. Like you can read them without having to do this like internal parsing and processing of like, okay, I gotta distance what he's saying here, but take this good stuff. You don't have to go through that whole process. Whereas within
but don't
like
people
New
do
Age,
that with the Bible all the time? They ignore.
Hey, can I point out? Can I point out? Even though you come into this world as a child with like, you know, literally zero experience, and the world's completely new and full of mystery, you're not experiencing it as a meaning crisis, right? Or did you experience childhood as a meaning crisis?
I think I did, but I was one of the broken home, broken.
Oh, no, me too. But
yeah.
I mean, like I had questions about life, but
modal confusion was my starting point.
And I can see it.
Did it feel that way?
Too.
Really?
They're asking these questions and in the same way, and so, or at least my
maybe I'm off base on that. Okay, my sense of childhood was, wow, bad stuff happens. Wow, that was really weird. You know, a worm turned into a flying thing. Like weird stuff happens, and I tried to make sense of it all. But it felt natural. Let's say it felt just like this is the way things are supposed to be and unfold. And isn't that interesting?
I don't think I had. I know. I even have an old poem I wrote in high school where I note hypocrisy, and I wrote like a perspective. I think it was during the Iraq War, and it was a perspective where you thought I was talking about an American or Canadian soldier, but it was from the perspective of an Iraqi soldier, just from their perspective. So I know my kids, at least my oldest, has said things where he notes things are wrong, and he's 13. So I don't know that kids just naturally. I think kids are picking up that there are things.
I think the clearest example from mine was from the earliest I could remember, because I would flip back and forth between the parents. And even at the age of like, I don't know, 3 or 4, I would bawl my freaking head off every single time I switched from one parent to the other. And this was every week. And it didn't matter which direction it was going. It was like a whole world would collapse, and then I'd have to enter into a new one. And then that whole world would collapse, and I'd enter into a new one over and over and over and over and over and over. So that pattern got pretty sunk in, seemingly, from and I experienced it very roughly. That's not to say other kids are like, yeah, now I'm going over here and it's fine, but
I hope my kids
I guess like a bit of evidence against the blank slate hypothesis there.
now you're making me guilty for my own broken home that I have with my kids.
Well, I associate the meaning crisis with feelings of bitterness and anxiety and all sorts of things like that. And again, I didn't have too many of those feelings when I was young. I mean, things were tough. Like, it was hard. Life was crazy.
There wasn't bitterness or anxiety. It was just sadness. My specific case, like
but it's also a lot of tears, man.
My kids know a hell of a lot more about the world than I did. I mean, they have the internet.
But tears don't feel like meaning crisis to me.
No, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, the lack of tears feels like meaning crisis. Apathy seems more like what people drift into with depression.
I do want to say, Brett, that it is a good point that you're making, that even like now, people will go through and read the Bible through a specific lens of like modern Christianity with like, just for that, like, I know there's,
right. And also, to his point, just because you have a variety of influences doesn't necessarily mean that's a chaotic cacophony.
Right.
You can be somewhat systematic in something, especially if you're an intuitive person. And I think that's what he's a lot about too, is valuing your intuitive processes to take a whole bunch of variety of different influences and he's trying to actually turn into something new with a structure to it. He's not just saying, look, here's a variety of different influences and let's have a chaotic cacophony, and now the meaning crisis has totally exploded. He's trying to synthesize it into something that he doesn't think there's a way back for religion, for actual religion like that I practice. But I actually think that there's a way that I can take what he's doing and put it into what I do, you know, and use it to broaden out not the message or the appeal of what I do, but kind of broaden out its intellectual
language, ability
Yeah.
to communicate.
Yes, exactly.
Here's how he sets out his project. Sort of, he says we need to respond to the historical factors, so the breakdown of the meaning crisis, re-articulate our worldview, and get back to that sense of deep connectedness, sacredness, that deep connectedness that affords satisfaction of our sense of being in contact with the world, affords self-transcendence, affords meaning and life in a profound way. This is what he wants to do.
And
that
I think
sounds almost like a religious idea. It's like one tweak away from in Christ, and then it's a Christian idea. You know?
well, that's why
you know
they call it a religion that's not a religion, I guess.
Right, but like that's why I want to take this is just a side note, but he's mentioned in passing secular monasteries, a secular monastery movement, and I was very curious about that. But that's exactly what he's doing is trying to find. He says there's no way back for religion, but what he's doing is finding a way back for religion, just like Peterson's doing by digging into the actual science, to the actual, you know, with integrity to the actual neuroscience and really pretty hefty philosophy. I mean, he knows his stuff philosophically too. And
but he's also providing a path forward for people who don't buy into the ontological aspect of particular mythoses, where they can participate in the advantages from these mythoses without having to buy into it, which like I almost see him as sort of it's almost a Jesus type figure of opening up the benefit. Like we haven't got to this yet, but you know, he talks about, you know, he reimagines enlightenment, and he sort of redefines it in a way where it's open to everybody, not just to the select few Buddhas out there, you know. And it's almost I guess a Kairos type. I almost felt like a disciple hearing revelation. It sort of I was thinking to myself, this probably is sort of what it feels like to hear the way of people from other people, like listening to Jesus, someone else, like this is the way. And in this lecture, we haven't even gotten to this part yet, but you know, like the rest of 36 and 37, he just, you know, explodes into this is, so here's the package, here's the response to the meaning crisis.
Right. So what he's doing for someone like you, and I'm pretty sure if Matt Dillahunty were having a real conversation about this, or any other atheist would probably agree with you, is what he's giving you is a way of having keeping your secularism intact, but still being somewhat of a religious person. But at the same time, what he's doing is making you more spiritual. You see what I'm saying? You don't realize
that we can all participate in spiritualism. Right.
Right. But he's making you more spiritual. He's bringing out your more intuitive, spiritual, and so
and I'll say, like, he's definitely, like, this series has had a pretty big influence on me in appreciating more what religions have done. You know, a lot of us, a lot of modern times in the non-theists, we focus sort of on the negatives of religion, but you know, this whole series has focused a lot on the positives, and it's important to keep those in mind. And I think I always say this is essential listening for anti-theists, because I think it's hard to stay as an anti-theist after listening.
What is the value of a human life?
2.
This might feel like it's a left.
Do you want an answer? Yeah. 34? Yeah.
$500.
Well, 42 would have been an acceptable answer.
Yeah, no, I was thinking of 42, and then I was like, oh, that's too easy. I'll just go with 2. Yeah.
Isn't there an actual, like, legal value to a human life? Like, if you accidentally kill somebody through
your insurance policy.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Where were you going with that, Tyler?
Yeah. So there are some elements, there's some essences that have dramatic impact on the manner in which we frame the world.
Right. Yeah, that might be an indispensable ontological essence or relevancy that we kind of place on other people that may not be as well. I mean, it is, I guess, in a way dynamic, but it's not something that we necessarily wish to be dynamic. In like saying, oh, this person's relevancy or value is dependent upon like the social context or something like that.
Well, okay, so just in a very simple narrative form, right? When I look at you and I go through the process of relevance realization and do a bit of meditative breathing exercises while I try to, understand what it is you're doing to my brain, your value is, I appreciate you, John. You're a great creature that spawned on the earth. Or you have an eternal soul that's piloting a body as a gift, right? And that the more you recognize that soul, the more you feel in tune with a deeper, purer sense of yourself. And that connection, that deeper connection that you feel gives you a sense of power like you've never felt before. And that you go about in the world doing good because you feel that. And it feels like a wellspring within and gives you a source of love, agape, right? All that stuff. Those are two very different ways of seeing people, right? And that matters, I think. It does matter. And, think of how simple that narrative is, right?
It distinctly matters at the level by which we can existentially incorporate that.
Mm-hmm.
It matters a lot less whether it is propositionally true or not, whether there is the eternal soul in the person. And I think this,
or how you could possibly understand it, right?
Right. And this is the part that I agree with Vervaeke on, with his de-emphasis of metaphysics, is that, or perhaps it should be recontextualization of metaphysics, right? It's the classic, it's what Christ is constantly calling out the Pharisees, why he's constantly calling them hypocrites, right? Mm-hmm. It's all proposition, it's all words, it's all speaking, and none of it, you don't feel any of it. You don't feel anything that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And because you're not living it from inside out, it's meaningless. You're actually going against your own religion by practicing it this way.
Yeah.
And I think that's extremely, important.
It's definitely true.
Then you have the propositional stuff in religions, Christianity. If you don't believe this, you and do this, you go to hell. That's a little harder to reconcile with what Vervaeke is saying. But I know, to me, the way out there is not the way out. That maybe there's at least the compromise that
I don't need a religion for that, though, man. Like, I say that to my kids if I get frustrated enough with them, right?
You're going to hell. You're going to hell, you little rat. Put that back.
Well, yeah, similar to the way that Tyler was like saying that by telling somebody that they have an immortal soul that's guiding their body, that gives them that sort of ability to self-transcend in a way that allows them to live out in the world. I think similarly, the tool of hell has been used to stop certain behaviors from.
Well, every tool can be applied and misapplied, right? So the eternal value of the soul can also be immediately inverted and be like, well, I can just kill everyone because their soul goes on forever. People do that.
You see that in both Buddhism and Hinduism. Hinduism more obviously, but it was weird to watch Buddhists do the exact same thing.
Yeah, the immolation. Yeah.
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 So the immolation in Vietnam,
mm-hmm.
And then there was a warrior group of Buddhists that were doing it where it's like you're cutting through nothing, so go kill your enemy, even though there's a very direct and obvious constant reinforcement of non-violence in Buddhism. Likewise with Christianity,
Yeah.
You were gonna say something, Brett?
Well, no. What I was, but I'm wondering if we should move on to the perennial problems aspect of the lectures, or
sure.
Does anyone want to wrap up on this aspect, or are we good to move on to the next session?
Yeah, we can move on. One of the things that I recognize, like as being definitely true for the perennial problems is his pointing out how it comes about through a conflict in perspectives, or like where you might have the example he uses. I guess it. Yeah, the example he uses is like, what is the point in living since a million years from now nothing I do will ever matter? And he's kind of showing how, from the perspective of a million years from now and the perspective of where I am now, these two things have no like shared, I don't know, identity or anything to them.
Piagetian, what's it called?
Oh yeah, yeah, I can't recall, but and yeah, and I think part of like how what we were discussing with like one of the problems maybe with New Age is the fact that they have the, like, you're trying to take all these conflicting perspectives and roll them into one singular frame, to the point that you might be watering things down to the point that they lose their function.
Also, it's important to note that the New Age is heavily characterized on specifically heavily appropriating practices without the underlying religious structures, stories, mythos, religio to uphold and contextualize the practices. And that when this happens, you get McDonald's practices.
Yeah.
Right? It's the soccer mom going to yoga.
That's
Yoga's not
totally.
for stretching. That's not why that exists. That's what Pilates is for. Or right. But this was
and now everyone
physical
wears
practices was contextualized so that you experienced them differently while doing them. And that gets stripped from it when you continually, right? It might work for the first generation. It might work for the second. But now, you know, this New Age attempt pretty much started in the 40s. And by the 80s, if not earlier, it was devoid of all of the rich meaning that was originally found in all the practices that they appropriated.
Well, Vervaeke would probably say they didn't merge it with science, though. So they didn't really have a deep. They may not have.
Everyone tried.
New Age science was.
It's who was popular and who wasn't.
Hey,
crystals.
Ken Wilber was
around forever. If you read Alan Watts, he is an exceptionally reasonable person.
He's Buddhist, though, not New Age, isn't he? Alan Watts.
No, he's clearly New Age. Yeah, he helped forge the concept of New Age.
Yeah,
is it? Oh, I thought he was.
Well, he was heavily into Buddhism. He was heavily into Hinduism, and then he was literally a leader of the Episcopal Church for like.
Oh, I didn't know that. I just knew the Buddhist part. So hold on. First, do you want me to do a little summary of the perennial? Sure. Okay. So what he talks about is the machinery of relevance realization, which again, I wish he chose a alliterative phrase, because it's really hard to say anyway. I always tongue twist over that. So the machinery of relevance realization, which makes this deep connectedness possible within us, can also go horribly wrong. So he argues that all these cultures, these religions, these people from all times and places and histories are prone to these perennial problems. So these inherent problems with relevance realization, which leads to meaninglessness and despair. And so these religions and cultures have developed these adaptive processes, these psychotechnologies, to help us address that meaninglessness, absurdity, alienation, and so on. And this is inherent, it's perennial, because again, it's the same machinery that lets us have this deep connectedness can also go wrong. So he proposes we need two things. First, we need to use the machinery of relevance realization to give a response to these historical factors that have sort of led us into meaninglessness and despair and all that. And second, that we need to take the machinery of relevance realization and religio and sacredness and use it to talk about how we can address the perennial problems. And this is where he introduces that he wants to reverse engineer enlightenment. So he redefines enlightenment. So he sort of borrows it from the Buddhists and the Hindus, I guess. But he thinks they take it a little too far, that it's a little bit too exclusionary. You know, it's only a few people like Buddhas who can do it. And he says, you know, that doesn't seem very useful to us. So he defines enlightenment as the set of practices that ameliorate the perennial problems and alleviate us from the distress and suffering that they inflict upon us. So, and he spends the rest of the lectures going through the functional, structural, and developmental aspects of relevance realization / religio, and shows how they can go awry. And then he responds with, here's what we need to do to combat those ways in which it goes awry. And I mean, we could go through it all, or we could, I'll stop there. And
I like what he says, like the very machinery that we use that makes us adaptive is also the thing that makes us vulnerable to self-deception and destruction. And he kind of points out how each of the components to meaning or to relevance realization is, if like gone too far, can have this like negative result that can come about. It was very close. Like even there was this point where he was specifically referring to what was the exact branch, but it was funny seeing how like there is very much the Aristotelian golden mean, that where like if you do too little, then it's shit. If you go too much, then oh my gosh, that's a problem. But you don't want to just stay in the middle, because where the middle is very much context dependent.
Yeah,
you can't abstract the middle. It's fully, well, and this is like Buddhism's in the moment, and right. I've tried to codify it as truth is perfectly dynamic, so you can never encode it. Every attempt to encode truth will always produce errors. Instead, there is, and this is like functioning off of Einstein's relativity even, you know, there is the truth that is exactly from that perspective at that moment, and there's no other way to describe truth except for within the context in which it is occurring.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I was remembering it was in regards to self-transcendence. Yeah.
Wait, what you just said, Nick. Let me throw you another thing out of left field. You'll love this one. Actually, keep talking. I gotta pull it.
Yeah. With self-transcendence, where the very like the psychotechnology or the aspect of relevance realization, where we're able to like we're viewing the world through a frame, and so like what is most important to us is what will kind of stick out to us. So like if we're looking at the world while we're thirsty, then my glass of water is going to be most relevant. That's going to be most salient to me. I'm like seeking these types of things out. But by taking a moment to observe ourselves and like the frame that we're observing the world through, that gives us a capacity to sort of step outside that, at least for a moment, and so that things aren't as relevant for that moment. But he brings up how, so the very thing, like when we're like trapped in our frame, we can like wind ourselves into the ground, or by going after this thing that ultimately will be of no utility or fruitfulness. But there's also the problem of like escalating yourself out of your frame, and like, oh, I'm just articulating these things about my problems in order to avoid doing them. Like that's a way in which you're almost taking a meta step on things, and through that as well, like you're kind of separate from the very body and person that you are and acting in the world.
And I'm pretty sure that's a criticism I directly leveled at him in one of our conversations, was like, well, it can't just be this kind of right. I usually level it at like the Gnostic philosophy, because a lot of it is like the world is evil in some way, and the spiritual goal is to transcend the world and leave all that filthy crap behind.
And that's also very much within Buddhism too, I think.
Yes. Well, and if you look at the Buddha, he literally has that exact crisis, and after Enlightenment, which is interesting mythologically, right? So he
that moment of self-transcendence to the point of like ultimate self-transcendence.
And then he's like wandering around as an enlightened person, going like, well, what the fuck what do I do now? You know? So he goes back to an old master, and the master's the one that tells him, you have to teach. And he goes, but no one will get it. And then the master says, if it brings even a single person ever so slightly closer, then it will have been worth it. And that's where he gets the impetus towards the most minimal form of action one could possibly imagine, right? Sitting in a park until someone poisons it.
Craig, you were
So
trying to get in?
first off, you actually talked to him, I gather, to
Oh
John
no,
Vervaeke?
no, I think he was saying in one of these
Oh,
conversations.
in one of our
Okay. I thought
Yeah.
you meant you said it directly to him.
no.
So the perennial problems are things that religions have formed and these mythologies have formed because they can never really be solved. They can only be a truly wise person learns to come to terms with them, like, mortality, things like that. Those are some of the perennial problems. And wisdom is you learn to live with them successfully and cope with them. And a truly wise person learns to live in peace or with the perennial problems. And you can borrow from all traditions where there are potentially not necessarily an answer, but some good perspectives that might help. I think Vervaeke might agree with that, but go ahead.
And and I think I would even say that it seems like what he's orienting it towards is this dynamical system that is created where it's both an answer and not an answer, right? It's an answer insofar as you can make the dynamical system, right? You put the energy into it to allow it to function and have it as a point or a piece in a larger constellation of dynamical systems that all feed positively into each other.
Right.
He uses the Eightfold Noble Path as his example of what that looks like.
You said earlier, Nick, that the truth is necessarily kind of circumscribed by the moment, and it's kind of constrained by a boundary condition, right?
Sure.
This is true.
Absolutely dynamic.
It's true, right? That's true. And this is the kind of visual image I get for true statements is something like truth is always trying to come forth, let's say, in some sense. It's always trying to come into being. And the subjective expression of that is like it's a mixture of curiosity and also lies, which is the masking of truth. But you have to know the truth in order to mask it, right? So either way, we're always seeking out truth. You can't dodge it. But there is okay. So it's always kind of trying to squeeze into the universe, so to speak, right? Like a pure essence of truth. I think of it like that now. And depending on the geometrical constraints of whatever system you're looking at, it takes a shape and a form. But in human beings, I'm getting too abstract, aren't I, John?
Yeah, a little bit.
All right, so it's
I gotta
just a
go,
visual
guys.
image, though.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
I
great.
gotta
Yeah,
leave,
thanks for
Craig.
coming by.
10 after 8. I'm going to go see 1917 in about an
Nice.
hour and a half. So
Enjoy.
yeah, this was fun. This was cool. So hopefully I will do this next week if you guys are meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, cool. Good times. All right. Thank
Awesome.
you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thanks
Thanks,
so
Craig.
much.
See,
Bon
Craig.
voyage. Yeah, so it's like a pink ooze, right? And you squeeze it through a meat grate or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get little, depending on the shape. Yeah, I know. I love just making it as weird as possible.
It just flipped to John's face. Oh, that's great.
Depending on the shape on the meat grinder, right? It comes out in like little tendrils, or you can put a star shape on there, or you can think of it like cutting cookies, whatever, right? So the shape is what dictates, the structural functional organization, the eidos, so to speak. But it's always trying to come out. And it's always coming out in slightly different ways, right? Like you and I are both trying to speak truth. We're very similar because we're human beings, right? So the space in which we're seeking truth is very similar. The filters with which it's emanating from us is very similar, right? But if we go and try and talk to a lion, or Nagel's point, I think, a bat or whatever, no common language, but there is one there if they need it to interact. And yeah, that was a really long digression for this other point, which is I needed to bring in something that never gets brought up. But this is okay. So Joseph Smith. All right. So I'm a Mormon. I'm going to give you some of the tradition that I was raised with. That it's a direct demonstration of this process, right? So this is in the Doctrine and Covenants. Most people don't even know this exists, let's say, if you're outside of the church, but it's a separate set of statements by Joseph Smith outside of the Book of Mormon, in the form of scripture, right? So here's God speaking, so to speak. It's a definition of truth. And truth is knowledge of things as they are and as they were and as they are to come, right? And then he gives further clarification that all truth is independent in that sphere in which God has placed it to act for itself, as all intelligence also. Otherwise, there is no existence. There's a fundamental limitation to truth. Like there's a fundamental limitation to the management of what. So intelligence is tied to this directly, right? Because intelligence is that which seeks truth. It's that which chooses within a boundary condition, that which, I mean, if you, depending on how you want to describe it, that which allocates the most continued choice, right? The most forward future conditions, the Piagetian equilibration, I think is the word you guys were looking for before. So that is what is always trying to happen in the world, but depending on the particular shape of the filter that's those energetic vibrations are allowed to come out, it, succeeds or doesn't. Anyhow, here's a direct example of Joseph Smith inscribing a particular vibratory explanation of truth, and Nick, Prophet Nick here, doing the same, right? So like they're both saying the same, almost exact same thing, and I'm agreeing. Wow, that's
it's interesting. It almost sounds like there's like a spirit to each truth that's trying to get out, in a sense. And I don't know, the way in which I can kind of understand that is like how we interact with the truth is, I guess, dynamic.
It's like, relational even.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it really does feel like you are relating to something other than you. And right, there's some point where there's the choice to allow it to use you.
Or sometimes it overpowers you, really.
Or it can, well, that's the other thing, right? It does. And that's why you can actually say that's why submittance is so, this is how I would describe why submittance is so focused on in Christianity. Because if you do not submit, it is excruciating. It's too much. Like it will literally make you a crazy person.
Well, you do both. That's the great secret, I think. And that's actually pointed out by him, that the great secret that human beings have, so to speak, is that I think the best way to describe it is that we do our own parasitic processing. The hemispheres counterbalance this in a very interesting way, right? I think that's the secret that allows us to do both at the same time, and
it has that exact feeling, right? Because it's again that bizarre paradox where it's like the moment you actually submit is the same moment you find yourself finally not submitted for the first time in your life.
Right? Think about learning to walk. Right there, you just did it. Think about learning to walk, right?
Yeah.
And this is the embodied element, the embodied element of perspectival and participatory knowledge, right? So we build up all of these deep understandings from this. Think about learning to walk. You are literally falling forward and catching yourself, right? And you're so used to it, but you learn through long pain. I mean, I watched my kids do it, right? They learn through long, painful experiences how to manage that crazy process, but it's a whole lot of faith and tumbling and toppling and catching yourself. So I think all of our emotions, like think about it, everywhere you put your attention right now, you have choice, right? That's what it is to be consciously awake and aware. You're choosing to do something. You're choosing to put your eyes here, attention. You're choosing to focus your ears. This is a point that John's brought up before, that with regards to the particularities of where your attention goes. But this is what you were talking about before in terms of intelligence and boundaries and truth, okay? The boundary condition is where the attention is. That is the boundary condition. all statements, all propositional statements, all knowledge, all anything or everything we ever do is going to be discussed within a framework or a system, and that is the boundary condition. You can't escape that thing, right? So that's it. That I think that's what that scripture means, right? It's not seeking some deeper spiritual being that's like manipulating it. It's just a basic
Wait,
fact
but
regarding-
transframing is about expanding that boundary, though, right? You're not saying the
well,
boundary is fixed.
Well,
consciousness does that.
And I would also say truth is almost in a Gödelian sense. It's that thing that's always, it's simultaneously operating within the frame, within the context, and it's that statement that's inconsistent that points you
transliminal, let's say.
A larger frame.
Look, here's the thing with
transliminal.
Look, here's the thing with truth. We can say there is a truth out there, like there is the right answer, so to speak, for a lot of these questions, but we don't have access to that. We only have access to our beliefs about what is true. So we always have to be in this dynamic state with regard to the truth, in that we have a current version of what we believe is the truth. We get new knowledge comes in, we have to reassess our version of the truth, and we have a new version of the truth. It doesn't mean the truth always changes. There is a truth, but we don't get, the skies don't light up with a ding, ding, ding when you get it right.
And I think that's
arguing for essentialism.
I still don't know. I hate the terms. You tell me.
Well, I don't know. Like the way I'm interpreting Vervaeke is that's like sort of the benefit that Vervaeke's sort of program has over, say, the classical religions is that his system will require no reupheaval upon any new scientific discoveries or truth learnings that we might come across. Whereas any sort of system that, say, relies upon, dualism or something like that, if it were proven that the brain or consciousness was entirely emergent from the brain, then it would sort of falsify that religion, and to the point that they would have to kind of like step away from the truth. What was it? The Nietzschean point, like faith saveth, consequently it lies.
Well, look, like what if in Christianity we could feel free to not just ignore the parts we don't like, but to literally evolve the mythos. But the problem with the doctrine is that you're sort of stuck with it. We're stuck with the Bible as it is. Whereas in the Vervaekean sense, if there are parts that we have moved beyond, there's no problem with changing the mythos to fit our new understanding. I mean, Christianity still does it in people just sort of conveniently ignoring certain parts and reinterpreting other parts. So we do it anyway, I think, but it's sort of around,
do you think
sort of
people are going to move beyond the particularly egregious chapters of the Harry Potter series 200 years from now? Morally,
no, but shouldn't we be able to update our mythos?
But it is.
We do. Yeah. We update it all the time.
Brett, I would recommend. I would recommend listening to this conversation between Adam Friended and Paul Vanderklay. That was something that really gave me an insight into kind of the inner processing between it was almost like the Darwinian look of like church planning. Like things are changing. One church will do this, like adopt this new set of practices. The other church will adopt it or retain tradition or something like that. And then there's sort of this observation network that goes on where you can understand or where you wait and see what happens. And then kind of like, okay, this is something that has worked on a small scale, and now we can scale it up to the broader scale.
You're talking about practices. I mean, practices of Christianity go way beyond the Bible, right? But the mythos of the Bible stays the same.
Sure. Yeah.
It has to be reinterpreted. And that like, to me, like that has to be like isn't that sort of a negative? Like, wouldn't it be good if we could be free?
According to Vervaeke, it's inescapable.
Well, think about it
like how perennial the problem is it's addressing as well. So if you go with like Rene Girard, this is like the fifth time I've brought him up, right? The scapegoat quality of humankind is a perennial problem. This is how we solve our problems in society. And if we do not have the permanent scapegoat in place, we will do this to each other. And even when we do have the permanent scapegoat in place, the likelihood of us forming another scapegoat is still extremely high, even though we have a structure trying to tell you, hey, don't do that, right? Put it here instead. So it depends on, again, how perennial is the problem.
I wonder if we can backtrack
so
a little bit, though. What do you guys think, though, of his reimagining of Enlightenment?
What do I think of it?
Yeah, like, is it?
I'm really not sure what it's being reimagined from precisely, but
Well, I mean, I think he sort of, if I get it, now I haven't studied Buddhism all that much, but my understanding, like, of Buddhism is that enlightenment. It's not that everybody can become enlightened or is expected to become enlightened. Like, it's a really hard.
Well, it
lengthy
is
process
everyone. It's just maybe over millions of lifetimes.
But right, but it's not something that just all of us are expected to do.
Not
That
within a
only a
single
very
lifetime.
few
You
people.
imagine if you're the last one in.
Yeah,
Oh shoot.
that's right.
Oh
yeah,
my
so
gosh.
no, but it's expected that there's only so far, at least in history, only a few people, a handful of people, are deemed to be enlightened. Is that your understanding?
Yeah.
Like
Generally
the Buddha
speaking, sages of various,
Right.
and even then, one group's sage will disagree that the other group's sage was actually in.
Right. So Vervaeke is opening up, and I think it's sort of like a Jesus type thing of bringing enlightenment to the masses, where he redefines enlightenment as basically, the process of addressing these perennial problems in a way that alleviates our suffering. And
If the masses are people with an IQ of 120 or above.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the purpose is to set the foundations for the intellectuals, and then hopefully they can like carry the baton forward.
Well,
because
remember, the psychotechnologies will be for everybody, theoretically, that he's talking about. I'm assuming that's what he's going to be saying, that everyone can do these psychotechnologies, that it doesn't necessarily require becoming a monk.
Yeah, and it's still like what he's doing is partially broadening it out to everyone willing to invest, I don't know, 50 hours into a YouTube series at least. But
All right,
at least there's
probably
no
a hell of a lot more than that going forward.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be a lot of work. I mean, I'm assuming at some point he's going to be listing all the psychotechnologies, at least they come out so far, as well as a continuing process of developing new psychotechnologies based on neuroscience.
I'm not suffering from a meaning crisis. I got to admit it.
Oh, snap.
I got to admit it. I have to admit it. And in fact,
look at you.
I would expect
Tyler
You're no
over
longer
here.
Wait. let us revere him.
Look at big brain. It's inevitable. No, look, the point I think actually is that if you look in society at all times, broadly distributed, some people will be suffering from meaning crises and other people will have like no sense whatsoever that anything is wrong. This is partially my point when I was talking about children earlier, right?
That's usually right before the revolution, right?
Well, it depends on the part. It depends. Yeah.
What is everybody so uptight about?
Someone's got to foment it, right? Like, someone's got to foment it. Look, in every wave, there is a front part and there's a back part, right? There are people that catch the momentum early and get out on the front. And then there are particles that didn't quite catch the momentum and they get stuck in the back. But everybody catches the momentum, so to speak. There's turbulent and weird spots, right? So you got to watch out for that.
I was wondering why Vervaeke seems to be so certain that there was a time where there wasn't a meaning crisis. I mean, like, he seemed to refer to like the time of Aristotle. Like, okay, maybe Aristotle didn't have one, but what is there to say that the peasants and
or the slaves,
the slaves, the vast majority of
right.
of
or
people,
you could say Aristotle's the ultimate proof that there definitely was a meaning crisis, and that's why someone like Aristotle happened.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's it. Like, he seems to sort of take that there were these really bright people like Aristotle and Socrates and whatnot who seem to have a handle on things and assume that their societies also therefore, or there were shamans that had a good handle on things, and therefore their societies, their tribes must have had a good handle on things. I mean, there's always been probably wise leaders, but that doesn't mean that things weren't miserable for the vast majority of people.
Specifically during that, what is it? I always think axiom, but it's not. The
Axial age.
Axial
Yeah.
age.
Yeah,
yes. That was almost
Well, she never defined,
certainly
by the way.
a time of extreme modal
Yeah.
confusion,
Hmm.
right? Or even right, the collapse of the Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire at all, right? That was an attempt to synthesize cultures at a level that we might not even be doing right now, you know, even with all our technology. And it was all united under the banner of a single, you know, superpower, which is even more mind-blowing to think about. But there was almost certainly very deep-rooted meaning crises coming up. I mean, again, you have the
other
ground
than Tyler,
to allow
it
a
may be
person
the
like
perennial
Christ.
problem is the meaning crisis. You know, it could be that like he's right. Societies have always been developing psychotechnologies and religions and mythos to help address the meaning crisis, but there may never have been a time when we didn't have this meaning crisis. You know, once we developed a certain intelligence.
I think it probably goes in, right? The more you push on the variables that increase the chance of a meaning crisis, if you have an extremely homogenous society, your meaning crisis is probably going to be, you know, much more mild than during the time of the Roman Empire, for instance, or during the time of the Mongol invasion, right? So I think there are definitely periods where we can kind of stick flags and be like, here's a crest of that wave. And then here's the calmer trough, you know. But yeah, I think, well, they're called perennial problems because they're perennial.
Although I think his perennial problems are, he wasn't really talking about, I mean, he could have been, but he wasn't talking about perennial problems and like we have this type of problem in our society. He's talking about perennial problems in the machinery of
no, but because it's in the
realization.
machinery of the person, it is necessarily going to appear within the within the individuals of the within the society, right, as well.
Yeah,
it might be more exaggerated because of, again, like our technological progress is going to make it go from kind of little pockets of fomentation to giant, you know, swamps of it. Because it's
but like the Hamlet problem, you know, whatever technology we have, like the Hamlet problem is where, you know, you can self-reflect, which is crucial, but if all you do is self-reflect, you never act. And so that's inherent to us as people. We have to reach a balance between reflection and action. I know I can tend towards the too much reflection and not enough action myself. So I never
certainly
thought, yeah.
Oh, and I think the only point I'm making is that there's a interpenetrating relationship between the individual and the society.
Sure.
Where they feed back into each other, right? We're going to be in a place of much more reflection of our society is all telling us the way we lived, you know, 5 years ago is now evil to live that way, and we should live an entirely different way. That's going to push on that tendency to get locked in a self-reflective state, right, within the individual. So there's like, they go back, you know.
I mean, getting back to the Enlightenment, I mean, to me, I get what he's saying, that if you present Enlightenment as this, you know, like you said, over generations, over lifetimes and lifetimes, you know, that doesn't seem all that useful for the individual here and now. But if I think maybe he should have just took a different word than Enlightenment, or maybe a modifier of Enlightenment. You know, why I don't like when people confuse terms unnecessarily, but I get what he was saying.
I think he's trying to intentionally appropriate it for its connotation.
Yeah, but then it's always
same with religio, right? Yeah. Of all the words he could have used there, he very specifically used a word that is one letter away.
Right. So if he had said enlightenment or something like that, I would have, you know what I mean? Like just not the exact word, because then there's like, wow, is that really what enlightenment is? You know, then we don't have to argue about that. We can just say what he's talking about. It seems good. You know, that seems right. Let's take these perennial problems. So how do we, you know, we have this problem of self-reflection and action. How do we go about fixing that? How do we go about addressing that? And, you know, if I do that, that's moving towards enlightenment. You know, that makes sense. Do you guys think, though, that like So I don't know if I don't think we need to go through one. I don't know if we want to go one by one. Probably not. It'll take forever. But he's set out these perennial problems, and he set out. Now he hasn't got into the specifics really, but he said, "I'm proposing techniques to address each of these." And if I do that, that's what we're going to call enlightenment. That's what we're going to call success. And I think that's the goal of the religion that's not a religion. And I think he says that's the goal of religions that are there now. What do we think about? I mean,
well, let's bring it back to Nick's earlier point that there are perennial problems in the New Age movement, right? One of them being,
well, did they succeed in addressing those perennial problems? So what? See, one thing he does express humility. He's saying, if what I'm proposing doesn't address these problems, I will have failed. So he probably would say to Nick that New Age movement. I don't know the details, but if what you're saying is true, the New Age movement failed.
I mean, it's still going. It's an ongoing experiment, right?
Well, I mean, again, I'm not saying it did or it didn't, but I'm saying if the practices of the New Age did not address these perennial problems,
yeah, they failed. The version that arose in the 60s and was preluded by the 50s, that version, we could pretty much say with certainty that did not work. Yeah.
But I mean, the things that he says, sort of, at least on a
at least not for the project Vervaeke is trying to aim for, right? Like in individual cases. So like you can go to Ken Wilber and you can have extensive conversations with Ken Wilber, right? And that guy's like fully integrated and put together, right? Completely put together. You're not going to you know find any shadow in Ken, right? So
I don't know Ken Wilber.
Okay.
But you know there are.
I don't know Ken Wilber either, but I've seen him a couple.
So there are a million people underneath him that are all arguing over like what tier they happen to belong to, and you know what part of the spiral they're really jigging around in, and that kind of stuff is like endlessly going on. And it all, again, I think if you consider the meaning crisis again as a kind of a differential field in the population, this sits on top of it always, right? So some people are going to be arguing about what tier they belong to of enlightenment, and developing weird lexicons of like jargon, and other people are going to be out in the field tilling, and their meaning crisis is going to be that the plow broke and the chain snapped and it hit their kid and killed the kid. Okay, that is a meaning crisis. Like that's what a real meaning crisis is, because what happens is they start the chain of questions, like separation, death, like the eternal nature of the soul. That's where the real problems come from. Those are
but are you saying real is in? I don't know if I'm reading in, but you almost seem to think that what Vervaeke is getting at is not real, or did you mean to suggest that? Or
no, I'm saying nothing that he has proposed thus far is going to make much sense for that kind of event. That's what I mean.
Well, wait, hold on. Are you saying that somebody, I mean, put it in Vervaekean terms, somebody who loses a child through a horrible accident, who has engaged in these practices that he's talking about, you don't think they would be better prepared to deal with that
which
than
practices?
Somebody who hasn't?
Yeah, we'll give me a sense of which practices.
Meditation, probably.
Meditation, reflectiveness, like he was talking about. For one of them, for example, is the internal dialogue. Sort of being your own Socrates. Which is sort of not the sophist.
Internalizing the sage was the other way he put
it. Internalizing the sage.
Did you by any chance take a screen cap of the board where it has all the perennial problems and then all of his proposed answers? That might be a good screen share.
Hold on, let me see.
Pull it up too.
Wait, I took one. Oh, I don't know if I did the latter one with the proposed problems, but I did at least the first one. Hold on, like that. Wait, maybe. Hold on.
Well, he's going to be going into them in more detail. Hopefully, not all one at the time. Oh yeah. Let's see. Oh yeah, so that's some of them. At least.
That's the functional. Is it showing?
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Parasitic. So this is still dealing with the problems that he outlines, and then in 37 he starts filling in the answers.
Well, I mean, I can go. I can. I didn't have his board, but I have I mean, I have my notes on it, but
Notes.
where so the ways to deal with.
There
so,
you go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on. Why can't I see the actual? I can't see. I don't know if I'm seeing what you guys are seeing, but whatever.
Yeah,
We
we're seeing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So he outlines. He breaks it up. Oh, do you want to do this? Pleasure or doubt? You usually.
Sure. I can do the quick thing. So here's the quick. He goes into each of them in more detail, but here's this quick version of the ways to deal with these foibles of relevance realization. So parasitic processing, which is this sort of, I think when you get into this cyclical descent of like depression and where you sort of eat yourself and it goes down, depths and depths and depths, which I know well, someone with depression. But so he wants to cultivate a counteractive dynamic system. So you need to internalize. It's not just having a system, but you need to internalize the system. So you need to cultivate it. So he says, for example, the cultivation of the Eightfold Path. But there's a very participatory aspect to this. It's not just about knowing different ways. And I can scroll down to my notes more on. I can't change it now, or you won't see it. But he goes into more detail with this below. Modal confusion, which is your agent arena like relationship. Practices design. No. Well,
Sati was the
Sati.
Yeah.
Yeah, designed to have invoke a deep remembrance of the being mode. Reflectiveness gap. This reflectiveness gap is that, again, the more you reflect, it goes up and up and up, but at one point it starts going down because you've reflected too much and you haven't done anything.
Yeah.
You haven't acted.
Mm-hmm.
So is practices to develop the flow state, right? So these are all psychotechnologies as a response to these problems. So
they're like integrated psychotechnologies, not just into like practices.
Yeah, like it's not just propositional. Like each of these will have probably like that's why he talks about it having to be within a culture, within a system where you're practicing these things over and over and over again. So yes, it's for everybody, but you're still going to have to sort of go to church, so to speak. Like you're going to have to go in a community, or at least on your own, which he doesn't like, but to engage in these practices over and over again. You know, he talks about in the structural ways, the clash of perspectives, which he relates to prajna and this part of I can't scroll down anyway, but so this deep scaling up and scaling down at the same time, which is to help you get this optimal grip, I think, on the world. So if you scale too far in or if you scale too far out, you're in trouble, but you can practice scaling up and scaling down at the same time and eventually get to an optimal area. Anxiety,
a non-dual state where synthesis of the clashing perspectives takes
Mm-hmm.
place, and not by reducing the definition of the frames to the point that they all just look the same.
Right.
That's the
and
up
it's hard
and
for me
down
to,
at the same time. Yeah.
Like I've heard Sam Harris talk about this too. This is hard for me to, like, some of the other ones I can sort of get. I think without having done it, it's really hard for me to understand what he's talking about there. I think that's, from what I understand, that's as a result of a lot of meditation. You don't get there I know you don't get there in a few weeks. At least I didn't get there in a few weeks or a few months of meditating. But that's I don't know what he's talking about there, but that's when you have to experience. But the inner dialogue, I mean, I do a lot of. So the internalizing the sage, internalizing what would Jesus do, what would Socrates do. I don't frame it like that, but I have a lot of the internal dialogue. My notes, I do a lot of that kind of stuff as well. Alienation.
Creating your adult to your adult seems to be his answer for relieving anxiety, which I actually disagree with. I don't think that one works. I think anxiety has a different root, but that's just a disagreement on my perception.
Anxiety is another one of my issues, but I do know that this process, this internal dialogue, is key to everything. For example, my therapist is talking about it's the key to cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, that cognitive behavioral therapy is a version of that internal dialogue where you take what you're anxious about, you examine it, you test it, you reframe it, and so that
I think
internal dialogue is essential, I think.
Yes, I just don't know if it's, and maybe it's how he's considering it. I don't know if it, because he has it specifically for dealing with anxiety. To me, practices that help with anxiety usually involve something like opening oneself to agapic love, right? Prayer works really well for anxiety, specifically not when you're asking necessarily, but rather literally the process of opening oneself to the feeling of being loved at a level that is below your persona, right? A kind of existential love creates the ground, a stable enough ground that the anxiety is relieved, because you're not seeking reinforcement from the world around you and then bending all of your action towards receiving that reinforcement. I think that is what anxiety, at least social anxiety and operative anxiety, the anxiety of acting in the world.
Although when you're doing that, I mean, there's still some probably internal dialogue. But I think what he's saying with the sage is to the adult, he's saying you can be your own sage. You can give your own sage advice.
Yeah, it seems almost like using the model of self-esteem, like holding to self-esteem as the basis for acceptance of stress or things like that, rather than externalizing, or not externalizing, but looking to an external figure to support you through this time or something like that.
And look, it's alienation, the cultural cultivate communitas. I think that's what we're doing.
This one was
here.
Fun. I mean, I can't wait to see how fucking far, sorry, how far off the rails it goes at this one.
No, but aren't what we doing communitas, as he sort of described it, that, you know, just what we've been doing in this series and getting to know each other and having these discussions and mutual support and whatnot. That's, I think, a sense of what he's talking about. Yeah, I think he's just talking about, so, and probably one reason we do it is as a recipe against alienation. You know,
his
like,
examples he brought up is what I'm like, oh, it brought my cult triggers into effect. My cult sensors were like, oh, okay, have fun with that one.
Yeah, and he didn't bring up in that point, like, okay, we also value individualism, so how does it play into each other? Like, but it's true, like, individualism taken too far results in alienation. Like individualism is important, but humans are social creatures, and we literally die when we're isolated. So, and that's not something we can ignore. You know, we need other people, and which relates you like you said earlier, like the value of a person. Well, we literally need each other for everything. You know, we need each other to be happy. We need each other to survive. We need each other for.
No, we don't, Pod.
No, we don't.
No, we don't.
Oh, well, why are you even in the call then, Tyler? You've like relieved of all the meaning crisis. You're like sipping on a Long Island iced tea up in Nirvana, and we're all just he just left. Yeah. Of course.
Hopefully
he proved his point. Oh, I'm gonna need to
he's coming back in, right?
Yeah. I have to re-add him. There we go. Yeah. Now he's asking for me to. Right. Oh, look who wanted to come back in. I had to like it back in.
Yeah. That was a good one. That was fun.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, from what I understand, like isolation. Let's like in prisons, like, you know, solitary confinement is like the worst thing you can do to somebody.
And I want to try to understand Nick's point a little bit better, because I'm not sure he's like advocating, like, okay, there's this parallel to cult-like practices. Now let's move further towards individualism. I'm not sure if that's what you're meaning at all, Nick.
Is that? Oh, no. I just thought it was funny. His reciprocal or whatever circle.
Oh,
practice.
yeah. Circle practice.
And then Jordan Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And then like immediately it brought into my mind all the questions about cult formation. Like, have you thought about this at all? You know, Vervaeke, are you familiar? Are you hyper naive about people's intentions? Because that's the feeling I get, is that he's.
Well, I still think he has to flesh stuff out. Like, give him credit. He's doing, or not grim. Give him a break a bit. Like he's fitting in a lot into an hour lecture.
Sure. Well, and I'm speaking from a perspective where I've spent most of my life poking at this, area. So it's
that's kind of the thing. Like where there's meaning crisis, there's going to be people latching on to cults because like whatever.
Well, because they're searching. Yeah. Why are they searching
exactly.
for that? They're searching for a way out of the meaning crisis. I mean, I had a friend who went from cult to cult to cult in university, and she was just desperate for meaning. But you finish up that. I want to hear more from Tyler and why he thinks we don't need other people, unless he was joking. But
no, I mean, I want you to give me the axiomatic reasoning for why I need to accept that. Because
it's
there
not
are plenty
axiomatic.
of people that don't demonstrate that, right?
But there's science. I think there's science that shows this. Now, albeit I haven't researched it on my own, but from what I understand,
let me tell you what Pol Pot did with scientists. Okay, you wear glasses, Pod. You would not have survived. Okay, you would be dead.
Look at this guy thinking he's smart enough to read books. Get rid of him.
Yep. What
do you need glasses for? 4 eyes?
But the point is that humans in isolation don't do very well, and science, from what I understand, supports this. That we
and there are some people that do better in isolation. We call them hermits.
Yeah, but first of all, that's few and far between, and even those people, I don't know if has there been research on this. They actually do well. I don't know. You're talking about a tiny percentage, infinitesimally small percentage of the population.
I don't know. It depends on how you define well-being.
Well, no, but I'm saying, first of all, I don't know. We probably by their nature, we don't have a lot of information about hermits. Because
this is a weird discussion since it seems like all of us here are not like radical individualists at all. Like I think we all kind of understand that.
No, right. But I'm pointing out exceptions because in the exceptions, you do have little dragons that you need to slay. You've got to understand why these things happen. They represent strange attractors in cultural phenomena. They exist for a reason.
Is it kind of like your point is that like in trying to communicate the need for community to somebody that does not feel this need within them, you can't just like, I don't know, give off scientific studies or examples of other people. You have to make the problem salient, or the problem and solution salient to the person that you're speaking with. Somebody that might be of the opinion that like, no, I don't need anybody else besides myself.
Can you imagine, just let me ask you this, John.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine going to church and the entire congregation is John Vervaeke?
Like even the pastor?
Mm-hmm. Every one of them listens to John Vervaeke. Okay? They all talk to John Vervaeke. And they're all super interested in everything John Vervaeke.
They're all using his exact lingo and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen those Joe Rogan clips where they all line up right when he says it's entirely possible? It's like entirely possible.
It's entirely possible.
I can see that happening. I want to do that with maybe psychotechnology and John Vervaeke.
Psychotechnology.
All right.
Have you seen the one with Jordan Peterson, like his little catchphrases that he does? Yeah, that would be pretty awful, Tyler. I'm not gonna lie.
I don't
like
want to
Vervaeke,
say that as a
a
disparaging remark to John Vervaeke, by the way. Not at all. I in fact quite appreciate his character and who he is and the work that he's doing in many ways. But I am a bit of a contrarian in some ways. And there's a valuable function that needs to be played in trying to understand, as Nick just pointed out, what's really going on here. He's explicitly stating many times, I want to help people, he mentions Jordan Hall, use these tools to get people into coherence.
I'll admit I didn't understand too much of what he was saying in that section.
I mean, I've read all, I know all about large group awareness training. I know all about like where authentic dialogue came from and NLP. I know all about all that stuff that isn't, it's like, it's tangential to what he's talking about. And it gets utilized all the time in really fascinating ways. And I'm really curious. I'm just curious because I do wonder, as Nick said, is it a naivete, or I mean, his intentions seem pure, but surely there has to be some acknowledgement, some recognition of tools or sets of practices or frameworks that also directly relate to this, right? Now, being your own sage seems like a wonderful capacity, all right? I agree. All right, listen, internalizing a sage and becoming your own sage, but surely someone understands, surely of someone of his deep reading understands that in any given circumstance with a large number of people, dominant personalities rise to the top, and people sort themselves into groups based on willpower, essentially.
Well, but he recognizes hierarchies too. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
like he's clearly envisioning a structural community that has leaders who help guide people. You know, he's not imagining some free for all where we all just
Right.
like he wants a he's against autodidactics. He wants a tough structure. So I don't think
so then we take the
That
piece
should
where
be
we
taken as a warning sign, given the rest of the bits and pieces. Again, just if you guys look into the history of the New Age, there's
pull that
lots
piece
of
in.
failed experiments that went along this exact trajectory.
Yeah, I don't see anything new yet. That's what I'm saying.
So is it just that like any attempt at building a philosophy for the people from the ground up, or with no like direct antecedent to it, is it just that like all our other examples of this taking place are from cults, and so like it's kind of hard
very
to
few like truly incredible cult leaders, and we generally revere them greatly when they happen. And there's lots of other cults in between them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Look, the fact that I want to kill you for saying something negative about Vervaeke is besides.
Good.
Well, no, I don't even mean it like he's trying to become like. And the other part of this is like you do not have to have bad intentions to form a horrifyingly dystopic system.
No, but here's I think the point I think he's saying is these psychotechnologies, while open to everybody, are not easy. Like they take practice. There's skills that need to be developed.
Yeah.
And just winging it on your own, your odds. Well, there's two things. First, your odds of getting it right are pretty slim, or effective are pretty slim. And second, you can become like Hitler. He said is the ultimate autodidact, where he just sort of took a bunch of philosophies and then went to these extremes and went crazy with them. So he wants to be very careful. He's very scared of the self-talk.
Yeah, it's just there's, again, with the exact thing he was bringing up earlier, there's dangers on both ends of that.
Sure.
And he might be erring too far one direction in the effort to dodge a set of problems that's more or salient to him.
No, but like John asked, do you think it's like, let's just say this: not everyone's a Christian, and not everyone's going to buy into Christianity. So what do you do with the non-Christians and the non-Buddhists and whatever? Kill them all.
Au contraire, pod. Every knee shall bow, and
and you all believe in God, you know, and you all are convinced by the evidence, Romans, whatever, you know.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
anyway.
yeah.
Yeah,
what are you talking about? There's nobody that doesn't believe in God. Sorry, go ahead.
No, but right. So there like Christianity, I think, has done its job and it has its followers. But like John asked, is it viable to create something for those who don't buy into that and who want to participate in all of this?
They're always already creating it.
Well, in a good way, like we've talked about the failures, right? But is it viable to make a new religion that's not a religion that works?
That's
like,
always already the question. That's is the viability for the adaptive landscape. It's like, is it making sense of the world, and does it comport to like the sustainability of organism of the culture and yada
does it appropriately dodge the infinite number of problems that arise within these systems? It's like
But remember,
we can't read the future.
We also
it's just
have
warning signs. That's it.
But remember, he's also not suggesting creating something that is brand new and also ignoring that has to be different in all ways from what's come before.
none of
he's
the New
talking-
Age was brand
Sure.
new.
No,
Yeah.
but what I'm saying is he's consciously saying, let us learn from these other systems.
That's what
so
the New Age
no-
was doing.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know much about the New Age.
Smorgasbord.
Yeah. But he's not saying just let's start from scratch. Like
Sure.
a lot of what he's doing is building on what has worked in the past, which I think, will give some. Now, he's building. He's slowed down again. He was going fast. Like 37 was mostly a repeat of 36. I think he's just now slowly developing. Like he hasn't really told us yet what he thinks it will look like. He's setting it up with a test. What do we need to be successful? I think what he set out sounds pretty good. Like whether he succeeds or not is a different question. But if he succeeds and he admits it's a bit of hubris, like it's a huge thing he's suggesting, it sounds good to me. I mean, without having delved into it, deeply, I'm sure there's problems, but in general, I don't see anything that really says, "Oh my God, this is terrible."
Well, I'm not
Is
satisfied.
he willing
until
to be
Vervaeke can make-
crucified for his
for his
There,
relevance
that's it.
realization.
I'm not satisfied until we have a good martyr. And when Vervaeke can make sense of that DMT trip I had. Holy fuck, man.
Oh
Let's
no,
be
but
real here.
he has made sense. He spent a lot of time talking about that. That's an altered state of consciousness. He spent like 20 lectures on that.
Yeah,
So,
well, he described it. He didn't explain what the hell's going on down there.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's studies that can.
You want to go,
I can
Pod?
talk
I'll
about
show
that.
you.
You know what? I do want to. I just have no idea how to get that stuff, and I don't know. And you're not supposed to do it by yourself. And
the grass in your lawn.
Yeah.
yeah,
You just chew on the grass. It's a great secret. The
Wait,
cows,
is it-
man. The cows
that
have
a-
been hiding this one for ages.
Yeah. I mean,
It
I
literally
definitely-
is in the grass. Your
Is it?
body actually has to produce an enzyme to keep us from tripping on DMT constantly.
Really.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
I'd
then you
love
have
to.
to
I'd
take
love
a
to give it a shot. I
MAOI
just have no
inhibitor.
idea how to do it. I just have no idea how to get my hands on it or
I've never
in a
done
safe
it
way.
personally.
Yeah.
But
Or any of those things. I'd like to try that, but you got to
they're
be careful. Like
interesting.
you have
I
to
don't
know
think
where
they're
you're
an
getting
answer,
it from.
but they're interesting.
And they have interesting. I mean, there's a lot of research now in helping with depression and whatnot. So
Yeah.
I'd
Well,
like to try to get into a ketamine study.
it just has to do with the nature of consciousness, okay? Because it's all like, again, it's all well and good to begin a lot of these discussions at this layer, right? At this normal, ordinary sense of beingness. But then when your frame is dramatically shifted, right? When it's broken so completely, it does produce a kind of meaning crisis, let's say.
Yeah. It just
So-
gives you a lot of content at the same time
Yeah.
that you can now autodidactically form a world out of.
Mhm. Any world.
Well,
you
that's
want,
where
almost.
Yeah.
he's saying to be careful.
Yeah.
Are there any other things we want to get into that we haven't?
There was one, I guess, question, or maybe it's sort of an open question regarding Vervaeke's project that I'm interested in just seeing how he'll tackle it. Is like, can relevancy remain or be still as impactful when it is separate from the belief in it coming from some sort of ontological source or metaphysical reality, something like that? Can the same amount of salience be derived from something that is held to be believed as being something almost like a transjective reality? And I guess this isn't so much a questioning of his project, but more so a questioning of human psychology, maybe.
Well, it seems like he's currently at a stage where it's largely devoid of a mythos. It sounds like he generally uses Plato and the Buddha as mythogenic figures to contextualize it for himself, but he leaves it out of what he is saying.
Mm.
Is that what
no?
you're
But
getting at?
hasn't he implied that he's got to introduce a mythos? Like he's
I wasn't even meaning the mythos, but like how he was saying he wants to separate sacredness from the sacred, because he doesn't believe that the sacred has
Or from
some
the
sort of
supernatural.
essence.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And so I don't know. I guess my question then is like, can sacredness, relevancy, salience be removed from what we believe to be the underpinnings of reality?
Yeah, I think he's ironically making a category error, which is what he blames. Right, I guess the way I would put it is using his own argument against him. Sacredness and the sacred are like necessary sides of the same coin. And if you throw either side of that coin out, you run into problems. And again,
But he's
in
not
the effort
throwing it
to
out.
dodge,
He's rethinking it. Like he's
well,
careful to say
but
that.
he explicitly did throw out the sacred for
No, he threw out the
sacredness.
supernatural, not the sacred. Like he's
Well, no, he's saying
redefined
that
the sacred.
he's saying that the sacred is not actually the well from which sacredness is
Why is
brought
it
about.
that these movements always coalesce around a leader, a charismatic leader?
Okay.
think
Here,
that's
hold on.
kind of
Before you
like-
get there,
yeah,
let me
yeah.
just read. Let me just read what I have here. Here's from my notes.
Well, 'cause
If
you
we
need
could
a
give up-
figure. That's a
If we
good
could
point.
give up the confusion of confusing indispensability with metaphysical necessity, identifying the sacred as supernatural, we would not have to be committed to a two worlds mythology. So he's not getting rid of the sacred. He's just not having the sacred be supernatural.
No, it seems like he's sort of disregarding the sacred as being sacred, but rather sacredness itself is kind of like what's sacred, I think, within his system. I know it's kind of confusing, but like the relevance, that was a question Vervaeke or Vanderklay had for one of Vervaeke's students, is like, is relevance realization colloquially Vervaeke's God?
Oh wait, hold on. Here's his. Sorry, I was just looking for it. And I found it.
Yeah.
Here's how he defines sacred in his redefinition. Sacred is the transjective relationship between the combinatorially explosive nature of reality.
Yeah.
So he's not getting rid of the sacred, just like with Enlightenment. He's sort of reframing it in a
He's calling it the
non-supernatural way.
inexhaustible quality of relevance realization, right?
Right.
Okay.
So it's still there. It's
Okay,
just not
sure.
supernatural.
Right. And that's fine. Like, even my argument or my question still stands, I think, because I mean, we humans are sort of like
What's the symbol of it?
supernatural seeking beings.
Well, if he's right, then if he's correct, first of all, listen to this. If he's correct that there really isn't a God and naturalism is true, for example,
Mhm.
then by definition, you're having those experiences without there actually being one.
Sure.
With
I
that,
might
right?
just be
So-
deluded. By, through these
But I think what he would say is those experiences get interpreted as there being a
or
Okay,
these
but look.
experiences might be derived from through the assumption or the interpretation that there is this being that's producing it.
Except
So-
what he's saying is
so
people
it's
have
got-
these experiences no matter what.
Well,
and
okay,
you can
well,
cultivate
like-
them.
Think of what is it, the square cubit Mecca? Is it just the Mecca? That I don't know. And like, you and I probably assume that there's no supernatural component to that sacred object for people, but nonetheless, for thousands, millions of people, through interaction and participation with that object, they derive the sense of sacredness. And so the question is, without that presumption of the sacred deriving from some supernatural source, is sacredness, I was going to say possible, but I know that it's obviously possible because we do have these senses of sacredness even without some sort of
Here's the problem. What you're
metaphysical
saying. Here's the
baggage.
problem. We all have our own experience of the sacred, right? So the only way you can
Okay.
really answer that is somebody who was religious and had that experience of sacredness, and then became not religious, and see if they had a similar type of experience without it. And like for me, who hasn't been believed in God since I was very young. I can't ever say because I haven't had that experience. Although I can sort
Most
of,
of
in a
us
way,
have the opposite story, like myself. Usually you have the experience and then it's like, oh, it
I got to
makes
make
you
sense of
religious.
this somewhere. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So it's hard because you're talking about describing an experience, right? So I haven't had your experience. You haven't had my experience. I haven't had Nick's experience. So it's hard for me to say if I've had an experience like Nick's that I've just interpreted very differently.
Yeah. So I don't know, maybe this will tie into the New Age cult problem. It is the fact that the New Age comes about through people yearning for some sort of mythos in which they can kind of fit their supernatural experiences with, or even not supernatural, but just their DMT trips with, just to kind of make sense of it, because like, oh, I had this experience of being one with the universe and I have to like have a mythos in which that makes sense. That works out for my worldview.
Well, here, listen, this isn't quite what you're asking, but I will say that I believe I have come up with an idea of sort of oneness of, we're all not joined, but we're all connected somehow. We're all sort of one without that experience of
without connecting it to the supernatural.
Yeah. Like I think a lot of mine, like I think I have aspects of agape and filial love in my philosophy that I've tried to that would be that I think I often am more like my whole thing is trying to promote oneness of bringing people closer together across cultures. I think I have a lot more of that than a lot of people who I know who are religious, and I don't have in any way a religious aspect to it. But so it's not quite the same thing, but I think it's similar. I think I've derived a similar concept, and I try to live it without that. Without believing in an ontologically existent supernatural being.
Oneness to the universe. Well, that's the thing. Like you can, like I was just speaking like from the New Age kind of perspective of like, oh, Gaia is the whole Earth, and we're like subcomponents to Gaia, or the universe itself is conscious, and like we're small parts to play within that eternal consciousness, or something like that. This is in which their metaphysics can support their ethics, I guess, like the ethics of equality and individualism and liberalism, these types of things. And so I'm wondering if like, does his metaphysics support his praxis, I guess? Or
I mean, if you listen to meditators, they will describe a lot of these similar type of experiences.
That's true. Yeah. So if he's like, within the Buddhist kind of metaphysics, then I guess it certainly has a long standing.
I mean, Sam Harris will describe similar experiences too. And he'll.
So I don't know how much Sam Harris really accepts the Buddhist metaphysics or mythos
he doesn't
at all.
But I'm saying, he'll describe similar experiences while meditating, even though he doesn't accept that metaphysic, because it's the practice that leads to the experience rather than the other way. That's
a good point. That like sacredness certainly can be and is being produced for individuals without any necessary connection to the sacred at all. So it's possible. So and if it can work for individuals, then there's at least a probability, or there's the possibility, plausibility, whatever, that it can be scaled up somewhat just by I don't know how, but at least there's a basis for
you're hitting on.
Sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think that's what you're hitting on is scalability.
Yeah.
And
that's why I'm like
have a scalable system with no sacred.
Yeah. And that's why I'm like interested in Vervaeke's project, is just to kind of see like, well, maybe we're watching a religion being produced in today's day and age.
This is what I want to ask, and maybe we have to wait till episode 50 for this, but what I like, obviously for someone like me, there's this place for what he's proposing. But what I'm wondering is what he's proposing, is there some sort of bridge where people who are Christian or Buddhist or who are part of one of those cultures could also participate in and not and enthusiastically participate in. Is this a bridge, or is this really just going to be the religion for atheists?
Yeah, because that's kind of the thing I was wondering about, because we've had a couple religions for atheists, but I think it's almost like maybe too niche of a market to really get its footing anywhere. And so like,
I mean, a religion for atheists sounds like an amazing thing. Like the problem with,
well, that's the thing. Like, I think most atheists become atheists because they wanted to step away from religion.
No, but what I mean is, but we left religion because we didn't buy the propositional aspects,
Right.
But we also lose all the participatory, perspectival. We always also lose all the other good stuff too. And like again, one reason I'm not an anti-theist is because I would never want to just get rid of religion without something in its place.
Pod, can I ask you a question real
role.
quick?
Yep.
Let me ask you a question. How much cognitive science have you done on your own?
I'm an autodidactic in that I pick it up. I pick this stuff up through things like Vervaeke and other lectures and sometimes I read some stuff. But
have you done much?
I'm a layperson.
Right. Well, sure, but have you done much of the primary research that Vervaeke has laid out?
No, I mean I've done a tiny bit of it, but no, not. I dabble. I go through phases where I read into it and then
how much trust would you say you have in Vervaeke?
Trust. I mean, I try to approach him critically. I think I think so. I certainly would never approach. I approach him as someone who's learned, who probably has some good reasons to support what he's saying, but who's also seems to be quite biased and is definitely. I'm worried a little bit about selective. I'm selective approach.
I'm letting the pressure sit on you for a little bit, but I'm not intending it to be like that. Let's say, my broader point is.
Would you want him to be the leader of the movement for a religion that's not a religion?
Well, actually, put it this way: I would want someone like him to be the leader, but I don't think he wants to be the leader.
Right.
But I would want someone like him who actually doesn't want to be the leader.
It's almost like the Groucho Marx problem. Like, you wouldn't want a leader that would want to be a leader. You don't want somebody to rule the people that wants to rule the people. Oh man, that's a big sign of something bad.
So, like, look, some entourage may hoist him up against his wishes at some point. You never know. Some school of Athens may gather around him, and he may continue a YouTube dialogue for decades to come, however long YouTube floats or our culture lasts. Who knows? My broader point is the truth value of statements, propositional or otherwise, regarding all these elements of knowledge and these conceptions of the world and even depictions of a future potential alleviation of the meaning crisis. They're not scientifically derived statements, so to speak. He's not providing empirically tested data that you can just consume and then be like, aha, this all makes perfect sense to me. There's a giant element of trust that
okay, hold on. I should say, like for example, I have some familiarity, a very layperson's familiarity, but like for example, I'm familiar that there is a lot of research into meditation, and I've looked into some of it. So it's not that and
at least he's like listing his sources too. Like he's citing his. He's giving his citations for.
He seems very legitimate, right? Like that's why he seems trustworthy.
And from what I know is I know a little bit about research into psychedelics. I know a little bit, so I know enough of the things that he's talked about that there are very few of the things he's talked about that I'm like I've never heard of that before. Mm-hmm. But so that gives some confidence. Where I place him is I think he's identified the importance of these psychotechnologies, and that from what I know in the research into that resonates with me. And because I've done meditation within the psychological context too, like with doctors who are doing it to help with anxiety, depression, and whatnot. So I'm quite familiar with that science. That resonates, and that I don't think he has all the answers, but he seems to be on a track that resonates with me. I would say that
Well,
I think
I'm
he
just
can
kind of
provide.
what I'm hoping to do is generalize a little bit, because I think this process keeps recurring, and so even if you, let's say, like, are personally well versed with the subject matter, and are able to traverse it and kind of make sense of it as he hands that out to you, there are a significant number of people that can't. Right? This is the scalability issue, and so as usual, you have to develop a hierarchy of authority and trust for a lot of this very complex
You need
information.
institutions, right?
Yeah, institutions.
No,
Exactly.
you're right, because the only reason I, as a layperson, is familiar with this is because I've been inducting myself into this world for the last 10, 15 years of I came across a lot of this research while I was in the community of looking at parapsychology, right? So I came across a lot of this neuroscience that he's talked about. But most people, you're right, the average person has not. But that's where you need leaders. That's where the hierarchy comes in. You need people to
you got to
say,
trust them, right?
yeah, to some extent, you have to say, well, whether it's perfect or not, we've got to start somewhere. Now, just keep in mind. I mean, I want to get to 50. He hasn't quite. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful he's going to say something that brings it home. Like I like what I'm hearing, but I hope he does bring it home, because
I'm just trying to unearth an element, I think, which is
for the public,
which I hope to see him raise or deal with, right? Which is essentially this pattern that keeps repeating, which is related to how cults develop and how leadership develops and how people attach the feeling of sacredness to a thing or a person, because that is the nature of attachment.
And I could see it becoming culty too. Like I think he's cognizant of that. Like he seems to be wary of, like he doesn't want to become Jordan Peterson, for example.
Well, what if you can't escape it?
That may be true.
So right, if it's too complex for the entire population to understand the total, the sum total of all the meaning pieces, and only a small subset is going to be engaged in high level conversations of things, what you do end up having is these coalescing actions, right, where leadership figures lead flocks.
What you're going to have are like gyms filled with these psychotechnologies, with instructors taking people through these psychotechnologies and hoping that provides, because from what I understand, knowing the details of the neuroscience isn't going to be necessary for, like, we have neuroscience for how
I don't think
works,
it's necessary to read the Bible either. I can actually just listen to my priest tell me what I should be doing.
True. But you're right. I think at some point you're going to need hierarchies here. Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's a blindness in his system in that I think he might be overloading a lot of the dangers of religion to the metaphysics. And I do not think it is the metaphysics that makes religion dangerous in 99.999% of cases. I think it's the humans. And what scares me specifically about removing the overt sacred, or rather replacing it with the process of sacredness, is exactly what Tyler just pointed out, which is people will form a sacred. They'll do it even if everything in their conscious mind is telling them that they should not do it. They'll still do it. And
I'll just say my favorite thing to do is to go on Reddit and go to, like, what is it called, PC battle stations or something like that. Okay, it's people taking pictures of their computer rigs, like the little corner of their room. Okay, it's like purple and neon lights, and they got all these really nice shelves with all the games on them and all the posters, and it is absolutely functionally identical to a little, like, set of hearth idols and gods in the corner of any Roman room. Like, it is no different, right? It's like Nintendo
it's a
is
ritual.
right.
It's
Yeah,
ritual.
Nintendo,
Yeah.
Sega. It's no different. It's the same process that they're.
But he would agree
engaging
with
in.
that. Like he wouldn't disagree with you there. I mean, and I think
Well,
it's part of
no,
his
yeah,
point.
And I think what I'm saying, well, my argument here would be one of the safest places you could possibly ever put the sacred, where it keeps the most aspects of sacredness that he's trying to do the flip with, is with a conception like God. Even from a purely functional standpoint, that is the safest place to form an image of sacred, because it dodges all formations of sacred, right? It dodges all the, right, it specifically keeps you from forming
I have an
idols
issue
based
with
around it.
I mean, I see. Here's the thing. I mean,
Ideally.
Well, okay.
Yeah,
So
I don't
what
know
is
about
it to
that.
be a human being? What is it? What is it that we use to define human being? What is it that makes us feel less like a human being? And what does it makes us feel more like a human being? What is it that makes us feel more than a human being? Okay. What is going on here? I will say the essence of that is our ability to choose. It is directly tied to our ability to choose.
Sure.
Okay?
Although non-human beings may be able to choose too, but
I can't speak for them. I mean, if you want me to, I'll try. But I mean, it's, I don't even know if I'm human. Todd, I don't know if I'm human. I don't know if you're human, by the way. Remember, you're supposed to be an NPC, right? So
that's right.
like, really, we don't know what's going on here. So
what were you going to say, Brett? In response to Nick's point, I think.
I think I lost it. I'm starting to lose my
deeper point is choice. Okay.
Yeah,
so you want to attach sacredness to God, fine, but people believe in God and curse him at the same time, all the time. Okay, all the time. They curse God for things that happen in their lives. They say, "Why did you let X happen?" But if you attach a character to the thing that you believe in, you have to attach certain kinds of characteristics to that thing. And one of them is, let's say, the recognition that if God exists and all of this exists and we exist as we are, and it's tied to these notions of choice, then there's something deeply sacred about being able to choose. There's something deeply sacred about how much.
But what does it have to do with God? Like, we can choose whether or not there's a God, right?
Well, he's saying we can choose. We can choose independent of God's existence, is what Brett's meaning. Not that we get to choose the ontological reality of whether there's a God or not. I mean, sorry.
And I mean, and also, like, for me, like, I have a problem with God is sacred. I mean, if I believed in a God, I wouldn't probably believe that God was, say, omnibenevolent or anything like that. I think if there's a God, the consistency with the world would be, there's no reason to believe he's omnibenevolent or anything like that. So it's just having a being that exists just exists because therefore we should worship it and whatnot. It seems like an odd proposition to me, but that's sort of a different.
So you can't say there's no reason. What you can say is that there is simultaneously a reason to think that God is one way and also a reason to think God is another way.
Sure. What I mean is, I should say there's no good reason, in my opinion, to assume that if God exists, that God is omnibenevolent, that just the mere fact of existing with the power to create a universe entails that one is benevolent. And if we look around the world, the evidence would be more compatible.
But
such a being who is not omnibenevolent.
That argument is always dead in the water, because for any human being to claim that I should trust their argument about justifying omnibenevolence or their understanding. So in other words, when you complain about the moral nature of the universe from an omnibenevolent point of view, you're making the moral claim that you understand what would be good for the universe and the cosmos.
Well, I mean, I'm fine with that, but then don't make the claim either way. Just be completely agnostic on it. So we can't say.
Well, I can't do that because I live and I breathe.
No.
And I move.
But I'm saying we can't say. I mean, you would say you could make the case though that God is omnibenevolent though. So how can you make that case if you can't make the other
It depends on what you mean by omnibenevolent, really.
I'm not
because,
making that claim, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Within the the Thomistic understanding, omnibenevolence is similar to omnipotence, where all power derives from God, all goodness derives from
I also don't think there's any good reason to believe that God is omnipotent. But this is a whole road to go down. I don't know if we want to do that.
12:30 at night. I don't know if that's
Back to the propositional.
Yeah.
Let's hash out the
one of the things that I don't know, I was just thinking
we're not supposed to make.
Yeah, one of the things I was just thinking in regards to your point, Nick, that I think probably Vervaeke might, I don't know, object to is like when, like, just because you're localizing the sacred within God, that you just made the point that like we are idol makers, and so like we're just because we've located the sacred in God, we're still going to be creating false idols.
Yeah, it's got the highest potential of creating a dynamical correction system. That's my point. We haven't come up with a better answer, and definitely the better answer is not keeping it completely depersonalized and away from the relational network of human beings, because what that's going to do is it's going to hyper load the relational network. It's going to make us form idols out of people that we think have attained spots within the hierarchy, right? There's nothing above the hierarchy to let off a pressure relief valve, if you will. And there's no way to autocorrect within the hierarchy.
But can we agree, though? But listen, we all know that religions have done a good job of creating these stories that people abide by. But can we agree that for people who don't buy into those stories, what Vervaeke's proposing is a good project, probably that it would be that if they're not going to buy into your mythology, they're at least participating in the rest of it. Is that not bringing us closer and recognizes a good thing, even if it may not be all of it?
Depends how you define good. I've seen a lot of systems go bad. It's almost like the question of like, wasn't it worth trying communism? And it's like, well, maybe it cost 100 million unnecessary deaths, but we got to run the project.
I don't know. I don't think Vervaeke's going to be that prolific.
No, I don't think Vervaeke is, but this type of project very much. I mean, again, you can argue Hitler's
here's
project
the thing, though.
was.
I hope he kills the bare minimum.
Hold on. Marxism has an inherent to it a revolution and a dictatorship of the proletariat. Like Marxism was built to go bad, right? Yeah. Like so. I think Vervaeke is trying to be very careful to avoid atrocities based on like it. Sure, you could, like it's hard to see how what he's proposing could lead to.
I see internal tensions in it from systems I've partaken in that will certainly lead to problems. They might collapse in on themselves before.
There's nothing that's problem free. Like listen, no matter how perfectly he lays out his system, there will always be problems. So that's not a problem. That problems is not a problem. We have to expect problems, right? But we want to avoid atrocities, right? We want there to be more good than bad, to put it in very simple terms. Like not that it's going to be perfect. No one thinks it's going to be smooth sailing. And sure, there'll be some jerks in there who forget about the different myths are okay and say this is the only way. There'll be those type of people. But as written, at least, put it this way, there are some Buddhists, from what I understand, who are pretty nasty and oppressive. But Buddhism, by and large, has avoided a lot of the atrocities of other religions, because I think it's because of the way it's set up. So it's not that it's done it perfectly. There's some horrible things that some Buddhists have done, but I think by and large, the system prevents a lot of that just by how
it keeps it confined. Yeah. It doesn't generally do it in the sense of like world dominating wars.
I think
it may do it in the case of hyper abusive leaders throughout its entire history, but they only kill their monks. They don't kill the rest of the country.
Right. So
So it's
I think
localized.
Vervaeke is I think Vervaeke has a lot of these horrors in mind, and he's being very careful, at least from what I can see, to construct this in a way that doesn't make it easy to go down the atrocity route.
All right. So I want to put a constraint. I'm going to put a boundary condition on what any kind of metaphysical / otherwise system, what's required of it, let's say, for this earth. And that is that we be able to manage our passions and the tools that we create so that we can survive, right? In the presence of all the crap that we are externalizing, right? So in other words, there is a hard constraint on the types of systems, behavioral systems, modification systems, all of it. That is, we must be able to survive into the future. And there is a very real narrow gate coming up in the future, which is something like the capacity to destroy large amounts of people very easily found in the hands of horrible, horrible people. Okay. So that's going to be a potential worldwide at some point. That means you have to have a system that's robust enough to make the entire system stable. You get that, right? So it's like in other words, if every single human being on the earth had access to a button that they could kill us, all the rest of us with, in any given moment, your system has to be so precise, so well tuned, so sensible that nobody wants to press that button, because that's where we're headed. All right. And that is part of the meaning crisis. That is why people are at each other's throats on Twitter.
Right. Do you think if Donald Trump had an internal sage, he would have killed that, that general in Iran?
Donald Trump is a single cog in a gigantic military industrial complex that has lots and lots of motivation.
But my guess is he doesn't put into effect a lot of these psychotechnologies that
no, he puts Sudafed into effect.
Also, just to be clear, I do not think Vervaeke is going to start some world dominating cult.
No, not at all.
All I'm saying is that if we kind of play with these dynamics he's setting out and look at tensions and things like this, I see weak points. And that's fine, right? Like you pointed out, every system has its weak points.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah.
So how do we make it stronger?
There's a deep naivety functioning here that
right. So
I want to be flags. That's it.
Yeah. So let's be charitable.
I hear my kid's still up, so I do have to leave in a minute. But,
so let's make that part of our side topic. Let's say as we go forward, see if we can make it better. See if we can find the weaknesses that he's let's say not discussing.
And he may very well address them. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. But this is the theme that I'd like to dig into is, okay, it's easy for the non-theist, but I'd like to see if there's something here. Like for me, the bridge building is important. And is there a bridge? Is he presenting something that can be a bridge between the theists and the non-theists? And I hope so. I mean, I like the direction he's going. But
how you doing?
What's that?
It's called a handshake.
Yeah. No.
That's all it takes, Pod.
I think Communitas, but I think to form a legitimate bridge, you actually have to remove even more than he has added back into the system.
Yeah, sometimes.
Which is ironic. But
maybe. But
well, I've been ragging on him a lot. I feel a little bad, but I appreciate.
I greatly appreciate Vervaeke, but
the criticism.
I want to end on that note. I really appreciate the work that he's doing, and I hope that, to your point, Pod, I hope that there are a great number of people that are personally deriving sense from it. That's what I hope.
And I should just say, from my perspective, the criticism is good. Like, honestly, we had way too many episodes where we had far too little disagreements. So that's good. That's how we push forward. Is by
I want its aim, as it's stated, to succeed. Let me say that, right?
Sure.
I hope what develops from it is a sense-making apparatus that can kind of float around in the culture and attach to any given cultic environment and help it make sense within its borders.
like I'm hoping that's a lot of like that even theists could say, hey, yeah, you know what? There's elements that we have lost. Like one of his things is, the effect of the Protestant Reformation that has taken out a lot of the ritualistic aspects were taken away from certain practices, and that bringing these practices are probably a good thing, even if you're Protestant. That there were some advantages to those.
And what maybe one way in which Vervaeke's project could provide a resource for even those within a religion themselves is maybe similar to, what is it? Voltaire, I think, said something like when I look at the Christians and the Muslims and the Catholics and Protestants and how they all have all their disagreements when they're fighting amongst themselves, but here in the open marketplace of capitalism, that provides a system in which they can still interact without killing each other. And so maybe that might be sort of a spot for Vervaeke's religion that's not a religion.
Yeah.
As this sort of neutral marketplace ground for which the meaning making and communication and translation can still take place.
Analogy, lingua franca.
Lingua franca? What is that?
That was French was like the language of the
language that develops for commerce, for the marketplace, right? It's a kind of smattering of various languages and where they overlap in terms of just in the marketplace.
Sorry, sort of a common marketplace of spirituality. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, that would be a useful resource for both the religious and the irreligious, I think.
Yes, and that the irreligious, the non-theists, don't have to be afraid of spirituality. That there's as much that we can partake in, even without the theology.
We're gonna have to translate lingua franca into Greek, though.
Need some sort of like Metagora idea behind it.
Imagine that.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining in, and everybody that may have been listening or will listen to this later on. I want to thank Craig for stopping by, and everybody else here, Nicholas, Tyler, Brett, and myself. And offer up an invitation for everybody to join the Discord, participate in some of the chats that we have, either on voice or in text, and maybe even participate in some of these as well, if you want to. So thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Good night.